Hey friends, tonight we begin with what ordinary life was like in the Soviet Union. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe only if you truly enjoy this kind of slow, calming storytelling. Your support means the world and helps me keep creating peaceful spaces like this one. Tell me no in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how this little quiet corner of the internet brings together people from all over the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan or some soft background, and let's gently into tonight's journey together. Imagine stepping outside your door one morning and instead of seeing neon signs, billboards, or the chatter of online notifications on a phone screen, you are confronted with the imposing grey walls of an apartment block. The air is heavy with the smell of coal smoke drifting from factory chimneys. The roads are not filled with private cars, but with people walking briskly, wrapped in heavy coats, their breath visible in the crisp, cold air. This is the world of the Soviet Union, one of the most powerful and secretive empires of the 20th century. And while its history is often told in terms of politics, nuclear weapons, or its dramatic collapse, the truth of everyday life for ordinary people was far quieter, stranger, and in many ways harsher than you might expect. The Soviet Union existed from 1922 until 1991, stretching across vast lands, so vast, in fact, that it covered 11 time zones. It was home to more than 280 million people by the late 1980s, all living under a system that promised equality and a better life for workers. But behind the slogans and parades, life in the Soviet Union was shaped by long queues, shortages of basic goods, cramped apartments, and the watchful eye of the state. If you were to spend just one day in this world, you would quickly realize that survival meant more than food, and shelter it meant navigating a society where appearances mattered, where trust was fragile, and where your place in line could determine your dinner. To begin your day as an ordinary Soviet citizen, you would wake not in a private house with spacious rooms, but in what was known as a communalka, or communal apartment. These were sprawling, divided flats in which several families lived side by side, each squeezed into one or two rooms. A single kitchen, a single bathroom, and one long corridor were shared by everyone. Privacy was nearly impossible. You would know your neighbors' quarrels, their cooking habits, even their snoring at night. A knock on the bathroom door while you were washing wasn't unusual. Patience was a survival skill. In some ways, these communal apartments fostered a sense of solidarity. Children played together in the hallways, and families helped one another during hard times. But just as often, they were filled with tension. Arguments over kitchen usage, over whose turn it was to clean, over how long someone occupied the bathtub. These were the daily dramas of Soviet life. The morning routine began with tea, black and strong, often without sugar if there was a shortage. Bread was a staple, sometimes black rye bread, dense and sour, cut into thick slices. Butter, when available, was spread thinly, used sparingly because you never knew when the shops would run out. Coffee, at least the kind familiar in the West, was rare. Instead, many drank chicory-based substitutes, bitter but warm. Milk wasn't always guaranteed, and families with children had priority access. Breakfast was not a time of luxury, but of necessity. You ate what was available, not what you desired. After breakfast, it was time to head out, and here you would be greeted by the sight of endless queues. In the Soviet Union, standing in line was practically a national pastime. If you saw a line forming outside a shop, you joined it immediately, often not even knowing what was being sold. It could be meat, it could be fruit, it could be nothing more than shoes in a size you didn't need, but goods were scarce, and passing up the opportunity meant risking going without. Shoppers carried string bags in their pockets, simple, collapsible nets called a voska, which literally meant just in case. If something unexpectedly appeared in the store, you had to be ready to grab it. A sudden delivery of oranges, for example, was cause for celebration. Even though the fruit was imported from Soviet republics like Georgia, it was considered a rare luxury, especially in the northern cities. But scarcity wasn't just about food. Clothing was another daily struggle. Soviet factories produced durable, but often unattractive garments. Shoes were clunky and limited in style. To get better quality clothing, families relied on relatives who worked abroad, or they turned to the black market. Jeans, for instance, became an icon of Western influence. To own a pair of Levi's in Moscow during the 1970s or 80s was to signal not only fashion, but rebellion. They were so prized that people sometimes paid months' worth of wages for them, and smuggling them into the country was a thriving business. Ordinary Soviets envied Western advertisements, showing sleek products and smiling families. Images that contrasted sharply with the bleak shop shelves at home. Work was at the center of Soviet identity. Factories and offices were the backbone of the socialist system. Every adult was expected to have a job. Unemployment was considered a failure of the state itself. Men worked in heavy industries, such as steel production, mining, or construction, while women balanced office jobs, teaching, and medical professions with their roles at home. Official propaganda praised the hero worker, presenting images of strong men and women joyfully fulfilling their quotas. In reality, workplaces were often underfunded, equipment was outdated, and productivity suffered. Still, people showed up because it was both a duty and a necessity. A typical Soviet workday might last from 8 in the morning until 5 in the evening, with a lunch break in between. Lunch, often taken in a workplace canteen, consisted of simple fare, cabbage soup, buckwheat porridge, and maybe a cutlet of ground meat. Meals were functional, meant to sustain rather than delight. Workers shared long wooden tables, talking, quietly, sometimes complaining, but always cautious of whom might be listening. The state maintained an invisible presence everywhere through informants, through propaganda posters on the walls, through the constant reminder that loyalty was not optional. Children, too, lived within this world of structure and scarcity. They attended schools that emphasized discipline, memorization, and loyalty to the ideals of socialism. Uniforms were standard. Red scarves tied around their necks marked them as members of the Young Pioneers. The Soviet Youth Organization, history, lessons glorified Lenin, Stalin, and the revolution. Geography maps placed the Soviet Union proudly at the center of the world. Foreign literature was carefully censored, and Western music, when not outright banned, was viewed with suspicion. Yet, behind closed doors, young people passed around cassette tapes of rock music, listened to smuggled records of the Beatles, and dreamed of a different life. Entertainment in the Soviet Union was modest compared to the colorful consumer culture of the West. Television programs were few, and channels even fewer. Families would gather around their sets to watch programming news broadcasts, historical dramas, or cultural performances. Cartoons for children were cherished, remembered fondly even decades later. Radio carried patriotic songs, speeches, and sometimes carefully chosen foreign news. For many, books were the true escape. Soviet citizens devoured literature, both local and foreign, whenever they could get it. Libraries were popular, and owning a collection of books was a mark of intellectual pride. Still, censorship meant that many works were edited, banned, or circulated secretly through samizdat, the underground copying and distribution of prohibited texts. Evenings in Soviet cities were quieter than one might imagine. Theaters and concert halls were active, and attending a performance of ballet, opera, or classical music was both affordable and prestigious. Yet most nights were spent at home, in cramped apartments, with neighbors just a thin wall away. Families cooked simple dinners, children did homework at kitchen tables, and adults repaired clothing, read, or listened to the radio. Electricity sometimes failed, hot water was rationed, and heating could be unreliable. People adapted because they had no choice. Humor, resilience, and improvisation became survival skills. And then there was the constant presence of politics. Portraits of Lenin and later leaders like Brezhnev hung in schools, offices, and factories. Parades celebrated the anniversary of the October Revolution, with tanks rolling through Red Square and citizens waving red flags. Participation was not optional. Attendance was expected, enthusiasm encouraged, dissent dangerous. To speak openly against the system could mean losing your job, being ostracized, or worse. Conversations about politics were reserved for trusted family members behind closed doors. Even then, people lowered their voices, wary of who might overhear. Despite all of these restrictions, there were moments of joy, love, and humanity. Weddings were celebrated with music, vodka, and dancing, often in modest halls decorated with flowers. Birthdays brought families together around tables filled with whatever food could be gathered. Children played outside in courtyards, climbing trees, inventing games, and finding ways to laugh despite the shortages. Neighbors helped one another, sharing sugar, matches, or even gossip as a way to make life bearable. The contrast between propaganda and reality was perhaps the defining feature of ordinary Soviet life. Posters showed smiling workers holding wheat, and steel banners proclaimed the triumph of socialism, and speeches declared that the Soviet Union was leading humanity toward a brighter future. Yet the average citizen stood in line for hours for a pair of shoes, lived in a cramped apartment with peeling wallpaper, and dreamed of things as simple as a ripe banana or a trip abroad. To live in the Soviet Union as an ordinary person was to balance hope with resignation, loyalty with quiet rebellion, scarcity with ingenuity. If you asked an ordinary Soviet citizen what their greatest challenge in daily life was, many would not mention politics or ideology first. They would sigh, smile faintly, and say, finding food. In the Soviet Union, meals were never taken for granted. The scarcity of goods defined entire routines. People would spend hours, sometimes entire days, standing in queues outside shops, hoping to bring home something more than bread, potatoes, or cabbage. The concept of a supermarket, as Westerners knew, its tiles filled with brightly packaged goods, did not exist in most of the Soviet Union. Instead, there were small neighborhood shops, each with long counters behind which workers doled out limited products. Customers didn't stroll freely with shopping carts. Instead, they presented ration coupons, waited patiently, and accepted what was available. A store might display sausages or cuts of meat, but by the time your turn came, the shelves were empty. families learned to cook creatively, stretching every ingredient. Soup was a staple, made with vegetables, barley, or bones when meat was scarce. Pickling was common. Cucumbers, cabbage, and mushrooms were preserved to last through the long winters. Still, there were occasional treats. In big cities like Moscow or Leningrad, state-run delicatessens sometimes offered chocolates, pastries, or caviar, though at prices beyond the reach of most. A bar of imported chocolate, wrapped in shiny foil, could feel like treasure. Bananas and citrus fruits, arriving rarely from other republics or from trade deals, became symbols of joy for children who remembered the taste long into adulthood. Parents would queue for hours just to buy oranges for a New Year's celebration, and New Year's was the biggest holiday of them all. Unlike in the West, where Christmas dominated the winter season, in the officially atheist Soviet Union, Christmas was downplayed, even suppressed. But New Year's took on many of its traditions. Families decorated fir trees, children awaited dead morrows. Grandfather Frost, who brought gifts and tables, were piled high with whatever food could be gathered. Salads made with boiled potatoes, eggs, mayonnaise, and pickled vegetables became staples, along with sparkling wine for toasts. It was the one night when the gloom of shortages lifted, replaced by laughter, music, and hope for the coming year. Family. Life revolved around these rituals. Despite the difficulties, families remained close-knit, often because they had no choice but to rely on one another. Apartments were small, sometimes just a single room for parents and children, with thin walls, separating them from neighbors. Privacy was scarce. Children did homework at kitchen tables. Mothers prepared meals while fathers repaired household items or listened to the radio. Arguments were frequent over money, over space, over frustrations with shortages, but so too were moments of tenderness. A father bringing home a rare treat, a mother sewing new clothes from old fabric, a child reciting a poem learned at school. These were the small joys that made Soviet life bearable. Gender roles were complex. The Soviet Union prided itself on being progressive, declaring that men and women were equal under socialism. And indeed, women worked in nearly every profession: teachers, doctors, engineers, scientists. They carried briefcases, wore white lab coats, and stood side by side with men in factories. Official posters celebrated the image of the hard-working Soviet woman, yet reality was harsher. Women carried a double burden. After long days at work, they returned home to cook, clean, and care for children. Men helped, of course, but household chores and family organization fell mostly to women. They were expected to embody strength, discipline, and sacrifice, even when exhausted. Children grew up quickly. From an early age, they joined state organizations that shaped their values. The young pioneers, with their red scarves, taught loyalty to the party, discipline, and cooperation. Their meetings involved songs, games, and speeches about socialism's bright future. For older youth, the Komsomol, Communist Union of Youth, was both a privilege and a pathway to better jobs. Those who excelled in these groups gained recognition. Those who avoided them risked suspicion. School curriculums reinforced the message. History lessons glorified Lenin and the revolution. Science emphasized Soviet achievements like Sputnik, and literature promoted patriotism and sacrifice. Yet behind closed doors, children and teens dreamed of more rock music, Western fashions, adventures beyond the Iron Curtain, and always there was the shadow of surveillance. The state's presence was not confined to parades or propaganda. Posters it crept into living rooms, workplaces, and conversations. The KGB, the Soviet secret police, cultivated networks of informants who reported on suspicious behavior. A careless word against the system, even a joke told at the wrong time, could be noted, passed along, and used against you. People learned to speak cautiously, to lower their voices in public, to trust only family and closest friends. Even then, they were wary. Children were taught loyalty so thoroughly that parents sometimes feared their own sons or daughters might repeat something at school that could bring trouble. Still, human beings adapt. Humor became a form of quiet rebellion. Soviets developed a rich culture of political jokes, whispered from one person to another, mocking the absurdities of daily life. For example, one popular joke asked, "What happens if the desert becomes socialist?" The answer, "First, there will be a shortage of sand." These jokes provided relief, a shared acknowledgement of frustrations, even if they had to be told behind closed doors. Entertainment provided escape as well. Theaters, ballets, and operas were subsidized, making them affordable for ordinary workers. Going to see a performance of Swan Lake or a Tolstoy adaptation was a proud cultural activity, part of Soviet identity. Cinema thrived too, though under censorship. Films often portrayed heroic workers, soldiers, or collective farmers. Yet there were comedies and romances as well, beloved by audiences for offering moments of lightness in otherwise heavy lives. And foreign films, when they slipped through the censorship, were greeted with fascination. Italian neorealist movies, French romances, or rare American imports offered glimpses of worlds that felt distant, glamorous, and unattainable. Sports were another arena where ordinary life intersected with state ambition. Children were encouraged to join gymnastics clubs, hockey teams, or track and field, not only for health, but to build pride in Soviet achievements. Victories in the Olympics were celebrated nationally, reinforcing the idea that the Soviet way of life produced not only strong workers, but also world-class athletes. Families gathered around radios or televisions to cheer Soviet athletes, feeling collective pride in their triumphs. But beneath these official stories, the everyday grind remained. Imagine coming home after work in the middle of a Moscow winter. The stairwell of your apartment block is dimly lit, the paint peeling, the smell of damp concrete in the air. You climb to your flat, unlock the heavy metal door, and step inside. The apartment is warm but crowded. A samovar hisses gently on the stove, tea steaming. Children's voices fill the room. Perhaps a neighbor stops by to borrow sugar, or you step into the communal corridor to wait your turn for the bathroom. In these moments, life felt both ordinary and extraordinary. Ordinary because it was routine. Extraordinary because every small comfort was hard-earned. Weekends provided a small break. Some families escaped the city to dochas, small countryside cottages where they could grow vegetables, relax, and breathe. Fresh air. A dacha might be modester wooden hut with no running water, but it represented freedom. Families planted potatoes, cucumbers, or tomatoes, supplementing their diets with homegrown food. Summers at the dacha were treasured, with children running through fields, swimming in rivers, and roasting shashlik over open fires. The countryside felt far removed from the grey monotony of city life, a reminder that not everything in the Soviet Union was hardship. And yet, even in these peaceful places, the system loomed large. A neighbor might caution you not to speak to freely, a local official might check in, reminding everyone that loyalty was expected everywhere. The Soviet state was a constant presence, whether in posters declaring glory to the workers, or in the quiet knowledge that dissent carried risks. Still, life was not without beauty. Music filled homes, folk songs, state-approved pop, or the haunting strains of Russian romances. Weddings were celebrated with laughter, vodka, and endless toasts. Children played football in muddy courtyards, their shouts echoing against concrete walls. Couples fell in love, exchanged flowers, walked along riverbanks, and dreamed of better futures, despite shortages, restrictions, and surveillance. The Soviet people created lives rich with resilience, culture, and endurance. To live an ordinary life in the Soviet Union was to walk a delicate balance. You obeyed the rules outwardly, but you cherished private joys. You worked long hours, but you celebrated small victories. You endured scarcity, but you found pride in endurance. And through it all, you carried the knowledge that life was not entirely yours to shape, but you lived it anyway, fully, stubbornly, and with quiet strength. If you really want to understand what it meant to live as an ordinary Soviet citizen, you have to step inside the buildings where millions spent their lives. Housing was one of the greatest social experiments and frustrations of the Soviet Union. After the devastation of World War II, millions of people returned to ruined cities. Families crammed into half-destroyed houses, while others lived in barracks or makeshift shelters. The government promised new housing for all, and it delivered, but in its own way. From the 1950s onward, the Soviet landscape was reshaped by Khrushchev's 5-story apartment blocks, named after Nikita Khrushchev. These buildings were built quickly, cheaply, and in staggering numbers. Made of prefabricated concrete panels, they rose like grey forests on the outskirts of every major city. On the outside, they all looked alike: rectangular, uniform, practical. Inside, apartments were tiny 2 rooms if you were lucky, often one. A family of 4 might squeeze into 30 square meters. The kitchen was so small that 2 people could barely stand in it at once. Bathrooms were cramped, corridors narrow, ceilings low, but 2 families who had been living in basements, communal flats, or barracks, receiving the keys to a Khrushchevka was a moment of triumph. It meant privacy. It meant closing the door and, for the first time, having a space of one's own. Yet privacy was never complete. In the older communal apartments, several families shared the same kitchen and bathroom. These living arrangements bred tensions. Imagine 20 people, all trying to cook dinner on 2 stoves, all waiting in line for the same single. Bathroom quarrels over noise, over dishes left unwashed, over who borrowed whose soap, became part of daily life. Children grew up hearing not only their parents' voices, but the endless chatter, arguments, and laughter of neighbors. These communal flats created a strange mix of suffocation and solidarity. Everyone knew each other's business. Everyone also lent salt, watched each other's children, and celebrated holidays together. Housing was allocated by the state, which meant long waiting lists. A young couple might wait years before receiving their own apartment. Connections and influence helped. So did party loyalty. Ordinary workers often endured decades of cramped conditions, dreaming of the day their name finally appeared on the housing list. But housing was only one part of survival. There was also the underground economy, the so-called second economy that thrived in the shadows. Officially, everything was planned and distributed by the state, but shortages created opportunities. If you wanted better shoes, extra meat, or a Western cassette tape. You often turned to the Blatt system, personal connections, favors, and informal trades. Someone knew someone who worked in a store or in a warehouse, or had a cousin in the military. Through whispers, handshakes, and envelopes slipped across counters, goods circulated beyond official channels. This wasn't seen as corruption by ordinary people. It was simply survival. To get your child a better pair of boots, you might trade vodka for shoes. To repair your radio, you might give cigarettes to the technician. Money was important, but favors were often more powerful. Everyone owed someone something. In this way, a hidden web of exchange underpinned daily life, filling the gaps left by the planned economy. Black markets flourished too. Street corners, marketplaces, and even back rooms of official shops became hubs for illegal trade. Foreign genes, smuggled records, cosmetics, or even forbidden books could be bought for a price. Western genes in particular carried almost mythical status. A pair of Levi's was a symbol of rebellion, freedom, and individuality. Teenagers would save for months or trade precious goods just to own them. Music, too, was coveted. Rock records, banned by the state, were copied onto discarded X-ray sheets, creating ghostly bone records that circulated among the youth. Owning one was risky, but it gave access to a world beyond Soviet borders. Healthcare was another paradox. Officially, the Soviet Union boasted free, universal medical care for all citizens. In practice, the system struggled. Clinics and hospitals were overcrowded. Doctors were competent and well-trained, but equipment was outdated. Medicines often in short supply. Long queues formed not only at shops, but also outside doctors' offices. Patients brought small gifts, flowers, chocolates, sometimes even money to ensure attentive care. These tokens were not required, but they helped. Preventive medicine and public health campaigns were emphasized. Children received regular checkups at schools. Posters warned against alcoholism, poor hygiene, or unsafe behavior. But the system lacked flexibility. Access to advanced treatments lagged behind the West. Rural areas were especially underserved, with small clinics lacking even basic supplies. Yet despite these challenges, Soviet citizens often took pride in their doctors, seeing them as dedicated, underpaid professionals who worked with what they had. Daily life also meant daily travel. Cities like Moscow and Leningrad developed sprawling transportation networks. The Moscow metro became legendary, not only for efficiency, but for beauty. Stations were decorated like palaces, chandeliers, mosaics, marble columns. Descending into the metro was like stepping into another world, a deliberate reminder that socialism could produce grandeur for the masses. Trains arrived quickly, carrying thousands of workers to factories, offices, and schools. For many, commuting was the rhythm of life, squeezing into crowded carriages, clutching briefcases, listening to the clatter of wheels underground. Buses, trams, and trolleybuses supplemented the metro. Weaving through grey city streets, tickets were cheap, but vehicles were often overcrowded. Long lines formed at bus stops in the cold. Passengers packed shoulder to shoulder. For rural citizens, transportation meant long, bumpy rides in aging buses or train journeys across vast landscapes. Travel abroad was restricted to the elite, but within the Soviet Union, millions took trains to visit relatives, to vacation by the Black Sea, or to attend military service. The train stations, with their bustle and energy, became cultural landmarks. In their own right, through all this, the West lingered like a forbidden dream. Official propaganda denounced capitalism, portraying Western countries as decadent, corrupt, and full of misery. Newspapers highlighted poverty, unemployment, and racial inequality in the United States. Films showed greedy businessmen suffering, workers, and failing economies. Yet behind closed doors, Soviet citizens were fascinated. Smuggled magazines, postcards, or photographs offered tantalizing glimpses of Western fashion, cars, and lifestyles. Radio broadcasts from the BBC, Voice of America, or Radio Free Europe crackled through the static, bringing foreign music and news. Listening was illegal, but many tuned in anyway, hiding radios behind curtains, lowering the volume to avoid neighbors overhearing. Western rock music, the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, captured the imagination of Soviet youth. It wasn't just the music, it was the spirit of freedom it represented. This fascination created a quiet tension. On the surface, citizens nodded along to official slogans, attended parades, and spoke the right words. Privately, they compared the grayness of their own shops with the colorful abundance of Western catalogs. They wore state-issued clothing by day but dreamed of Levi's and leather jackets. They read officially approved literature at school, but whispered about forbidden books by Solzhenitsyn or smuggled novels from abroad. And yet, not everything Western was seen as superior. Soviet citizens took pride in their own culture ballet, literature, space achievements. They saw themselves as heirs to Tolstoy and Tchaikovsky, Gagarin and Pushkin. This pride coexisted with longing, a complicated blend of admiration, envy, and defiance. Ordinary life in the Soviet Union was shaped by this duality, the reality of shortages and restrictions, and the dream of something more glimpsed across. The Iron Curtain, so each day unfolded with contradictions. A man might return from work in a factory producing tractors, step into his cramped Khrushchevka apartment, eat soup with bread, and then sit at a kitchen table listening to forbidden Western radio. A woman might spend hours queuing for butter, sew her children's clothes late into the night, and still attend the ballet with pride, wearing her best though worn dress. Children studied Lenin's words at school by day and sang Beatles songs at night. Life was lived in this grey zone between public loyalty and private truth. If there was one constant in the life of an ordinary Soviet citizen, it was work. Everyone had a place, and nearly everyone worked. Officially, unemployment did not exist in the Soviet Union. The state guaranteed a job for every adult, whether as a factory worker, a teacher, a nurse, or an engineer. For men, this was both a responsibility and a source of pride. For women, it often meant juggling double duty, working in offices or factories during the day, then rushing home to cook, clean, and raise children. The workplace itself was a curious mixture of drudgery, solidarity, and ideology. On paper, the Soviet Union was an industrial powerhouse. Giant factories stretched across the land, producing tractors, tanks, cars, steel, and cement. But inside those workplaces, conditions varied dramatically. Some factories were modern and efficient. Others were cold, poorly lit, and filled with outdated machines that broke down constantly. Yet, for many workers, the factory or office was more than just a workplace, it was a community. Co-workers celebrated birthdays together, shared meals in canteens, and helped each other out when times were hard. Every enterprise had its profsoyuz, or trade union committee, which organized cultural activities, handed out scarce vacation vouchers, and acted as a link between workers and management. At the same time, Every workplace was heavily politicized. Party officials monitored behavior, and meetings often began with political slogans, reminders of socialist ideals, or praise for the latest 5-year plan. Work rhythms could be unpredictable. Sometimes there was little to do, and workers idled at their machines, chatting or drinking tea. At other times, during production pushes, everyone worked long hours to meet quotas, often resorting to improvisation to get the job done. Deadlines mattered more than quality, leading to broken products and wasted resources. Workers joked about this culture of quantity over quality, coining darkly humorous sayings like, "They pretend to pay us, and we pretend to work." Still, employment carried perks. Wages were modest, but jobs came with social benefits, free healthcare, subsidized childcare, guaranteed pensions. For many families, the security of knowing that you would always have work and that your children would offer comfort, even if the work itself was monotonous. Education followed, a similar pattern of pride mixed with strict control. The Soviet Union prided itself on eliminating illiteracy and providing free education to all. From the earliest years, children entered a world of rigid schedules and ideological training. In kindergarten, they learned songs about Lenin and the party. In school, they studied mathematics, literature, and science, alongside political instruction. History lessons glorified the revolution, the triumph of socialism, and the sacrifices of the Great Patriotic War. Teachers held respected positions, though they too faced shortages of books, chalk, even heating in classrooms. Students wore uniforms, stood when teachers entered the room, and learned discipline alongside knowledge. The brightest students advanced into specialized schools or universities, often with state support. Science and engineering were especially encouraged, as the Soviet Union competed with the West in technology and space exploration. The launch of Sputnik and the flight of Yuri Gagarin inspired entire generations of Soviet children to dream of stars, rockets, and scientific achievement. But education was also a tool of control. Alternative views of history or politics were not tolerated. Religion, too, was suppressed. Officially, the Soviet Union was an atheist state. Churches, mosques, and synagogues were closed, repurposed, or monitored. Religious instruction was banned, and believers were often mocked as backward or uneducated. Yet, faith persisted quietly. Elderly women still lit candles in hidden corners of churches. Families still baptized their children in secret. Religion survived in whispers and traditions, carried quietly through the generations despite official hostility. For leisure, the state both restricted and provided. Ordinary life could feel grey and monotonous, but there were outlets for joy. Theaters, cinemas, and concert halls offered cheap tickets, giving people access to ballet, opera, and classical music. Soviet cinema thrived, producing films both patriotic and entertaining, from heroic war dramas to light-hearted comedies. Sports were heavily promoted, and stadiums filled with cheering crowds. Children were encouraged to join athletic clubs, and the Soviet Union's Olympic athletes became symbols of national pride. Vacations were a particularly cherished part of life. Thanks to trade unions, many workers received vouchers to sanatoriums, holiday resorts scattered across the Soviet Union. The Black Sea coast, with its beaches in Crimea and Sochi, became a dream destination. Families saved for years or relied on connections to secure a spot. There for 2 weeks, they could relax, swim, eat better food, and feel like part of a healthier happier Soviet ideal. Others traveled to camps in the mountains or countryside, enjoying hiking, fresh air, and organized cultural activities. Children, too, had their own special retreats. The young pioneers, the Soviet equivalent of scouts, ran summer camps filled with games, songs, and ideological instruction. The most famous of all was Artek on the Black Sea, a paradise for the lucky few who earned a place. For millions of children, these camps were among the happiest memories of youth, swimming, building campfires, and learning to march in uniform, all under the red banner of socialism. At home, leisure was simpler. Families gathered around radios, and later televisions, to watch state broadcasts. Popular shows entertained millions, from comedy sketches to historical dramas. Reading was another passion. Soviet citizens devoured novels, poetry, and newspapers. Libraries were packed, and literature was affordable, even if censored. For intellectuals, the kitchen table became a cultural hub. In cramped apartments, friends gathered to drink tea or vodka, discuss philosophy and politics, and share forbidden books. These intimate gatherings offered a taste of freedom that public life denied. And through all of this, the shortages, the propaganda, the restrictions, Soviet citizens found ways to create meaning. They celebrated birthdays and weddings with laughter and dancing, even if the food was scarce. They raised children with hopes of a better future, despite knowing how difficult life could be. They found pride in space triumphs, in great literature, in their endurance, and they found solidarity in one another. For all its grayness, the Soviet Union was not simply a land of suffering. It was a land of contradictions, of shortages and abundance, control and creativity, oppression and resilience. To live an ordinary life in the Soviet Union was to walk a delicate line between public loyalty and private truth, between scarcity and ingenuity, between what was allowed and what was dreamed. When night fell, Soviet cities looked different. Neon lights flickered on Lenin statues. Couples strolled down wide boulevards. Children played on courtyards between grey apartment blocks, and neighbors gathered in stairwells to chat. The hum of radios drifted through open windows, some playing Soviet songs, others tuned quietly to forbidden stations. For a few hours, people set aside the worries of lines, shortages, and politics. They told stories, sang songs, and dreamed of tomorrow. And that, perhaps, was the heart of it. Ordinary Soviet life was not about heroic leaders or five-year plans. It was about millions of ordinary men and women, carving out small moments of joy and dignity in a system that often seemed indifferent to their humanity. To truly understand what ordinary life was like in the Soviet Union, one must step inside the home. For behind the grey walls of apartment blocks and the cramped rooms of communal housing, the family became the center of everything. It was here, in kitchens thick with the smell of cabbage soup and tea, that Soviet citizens lived out their most personal joys, sorrows, and struggles. Marriage in the Soviet Union was at once highly practical and deeply emotional. Couples rarely had the luxury of long, private courtships. Housing shortages meant that newlyweds often moved in with parents or shared space with extended family. Privacy was scarce. In communal apartments, several families lived side by side, sharing the same kitchen and bathroom. Arguments flared over stove burners, refrigerator space, and laundry schedules. Yet, in these cramped quarters, bonds also formed. Children grew up surrounded not only by parents and siblings, but by neighbors who became like extended kin. Despite these challenges, love persisted. Weddings were a cherished celebration, though they lacked the opulence of Western traditions. A registry office provided the official ceremony, with couples signing papers under the stern gaze of state officials. Some followed this with a modest party family gathered in a living room. A table laden with whatever food could be managed. Pickled vegetables, black bread, perhaps a roast chicken if one had the means. Vodka was a constant, toasting the couple and loosening the atmosphere. Music played on an accordion or a gramophone. Guests danced in tight spaces, laughter filling the night. Children were at the heart of family life. From the moment they were born, they were raised not only by their parents, but by the state itself. Mothers often returned to work quickly, aided by free childcare and kindergartens. Soviet ideology emphasized that women could and should contribute to the workforce alongside men. Propaganda posters showed cheerful women operating tractors or teaching in classrooms, smiling as if the balance between career and motherhood were effortless. In reality, it was anything but. Women bore a double burden: full-time work outside the home and full responsibility for housework inside it. Men might help occasionally, but cultural expectations placed domestic duties squarely on women's shoulders. Even after long shifts at factories or offices, mothers cooked meals, washed clothes by hand, and oversaw homework. Yet many Soviet women also found pride in this role, seeing themselves as pillars of both family and society. They were builders of socialism and caretakers of the next generation. Children's lives were structured from the earliest years. At kindergarten, they sang songs about Lenin, learned poems about workers, and practiced marching in little uniforms. At school, the day began with patriotic rituals, saluting flags, pledging loyalty to the motherland. Academic expectations were strict. Good grades brought honor not just to the child, but to the whole family, while poor performance risked shame. Parents encouraged discipline, obedience, and a strong sense of duty. Yet childhood was not without joy. Summer brought neighborhood games in courtyards, makeshift soccer matches with ragged balls, sledding in snowy streets, or berry-picking trips with grandparents. Dolls, toy soldiers, and board games circulated. Though choices were limited, creativity filled the gaps. Children crafted toys from scraps of wood, drew pictures on reused paper, and invented elaborate stories. Friendships forged in these modest surroundings often lasted a lifetime. Family meals were modest but meaningful. A typical dinner might include borscht or cabbage soup, potatoes, a small portion of meat, and rye bread. On special occasions, New Year's Eve, birthdays, anniversaries, the table transformed into a feast. Salads, like Olivier, a Russian potato. Salad with peas, carrots, pickles, and mayonnaise were beloved staples. Herring under fur coat, pickled mushrooms, and bottles of homemade preserves filled the table. Families spent days preparing these meals, often saving scarce ingredients just for the occasion. New Year's, in particular, became the most celebrated holiday of the year. With Christmas suppressed by the atheist state, New Year's took on the role of both secular and spiritual renewal. Families decorated Yolka New Year's trees with glass ornaments and tinsel. Children awaited dead Moreau's grandfather Frost, who arrived with gifts, much like Santa Claus in the West. At midnight, radio and television broadcasts rang out with speeches from Moscow, followed by fireworks. For one night, scarcity was forgotten, and hope for the coming year filled households. The Soviet state was deeply invested in family life, but always with an ideological lens. From the 1930s onward, pronatalist policies encouraged larger families, offering medals and financial incentives to mothers with many children. Divorce was permitted but stigmatized. Abortion, though legalized, was restricted at various times depending on political campaigns. Families were viewed as the foundation of a strong socialist society, but they were also subject to the state's goals. Parenting, in many ways, was a partnership with the government itself. Grandparents played a crucial role in ordinary Soviet households. With parents working long hours, grandparents often cared for children, passing down traditions and offering stability. They told stories from pre-revolutionary times, shared folk songs, and whispered tales of hardship from the Stalin years. In this way, memory flowed quietly through generations. Even when official history books tried to erase or rewrite the past. Despite hardships, family bonds ran deep. Weddings, baptisms, sometimes done secretly, funerals, and anniversaries brought people together. Even within a system that discouraged religion, rituals of life and death persisted in homes, shaping the rhythms of existence. Soviet families, in their resilience, managed to carve out private spheres of warmth within a society that so often intruded upon the personal. And at the center of all this was the kitchen. In small apartments, the kitchen table was more than a piece of furniture, it was a sacred space. Here, family members gathered for meals, whispered conversations, and confessions. Friends visited and lingered late into the night, sipping tea from glass mugs in metal holders or sharing vodka poured into mismatched cups. Secrets were spoken softly, radios tuned to forbidden Western stations played faintly, and stories passed from one generation to the next. The kitchen was where joy and grief alike were processed. A promotion at work. It was toasted with vodka. In the kitchen, the loss of a relative, mourned with black bread and memories at the same table. It was here, more than anywhere else, that Soviet citizens felt most alive, most human, most free to be themselves. Thus, while the Soviet state exerted control over every aspect of public life, the family remained a fortress of intimacy. Despite overcrowded apartments, shortages, and political intrusion, families adapted. They found ways to celebrate, to mourn, to love, and to endure. In this way, the Soviet Union was built not only on ideology and industrial strength, but on millions of kitchens filled with laughter, arguments, clinking glasses, and the quiet hum of ordinary human life. To grasp the heart of Soviet society, one cannot stop at the family door. Beyond the intimate world of parents, children, and grandparents lay another layer of life friends, neighbors, and the peculiar community forged by necessity. For Soviet citizens, friendship and community ties were not merely pleasant. They were essential tools for survival. In a land where scarcity defined nearly everything, connections could mean the difference between enduring hardship or finding relief. A well-placed friend at a store might quietly set aside a kilo of sausage for you. A neighbor who worked in a warehouse might help secure shoes for your children. Informal networks, often invisible to outsiders, formed the backbone of everyday life. These exchanges were not purely transactional. They were bound up with loyalty, obligation, and trust. In a society where official channels often failed to provide, ordinary people created their own web of support. Nowhere was this interdependence clearer than in the communal apartment, or communalka. Imagine a single large apartment in a building divided into sections after the Bolshevik Revolution. Each family was assigned a room, sometimes two if they were fortunate. and all shared the same bathroom, corridors, and most importantly, the same kitchen. Life in a communalka was both vibrant and exhausting. On the one hand, you were never alone. Doors stood ajar, and the cries of babies, the laughter of children, and the sound of radios blended into a constant backdrop. Families bumped into each other in the hallway, exchanged gossip over tea, and borrowed salt or matches as needed. Children played together in the courtyards, their friendships spanning across family boundaries. The closeness created a sense of extended community. An entire floor of neighbors became surrogate family. But this closeness came at a cost. Privacy was nearly non-existent. The kitchen, often considered the soul of a Soviet home, became a battleground. Each family claimed a corner of the counter, a section of the refrigerator, and perhaps one stove burner. Arguments erupted over unwashed dishes, stolen food, or encroachment into another family's space. Even the bathroom was a contested zone, with schedules taped to the door to determine who could bathe when. Small irritations built up, and feuds could last for years. Yet, just as often, moments of solidarity emerged. Neighbors would share food during shortages, watch each other's children, or come together to celebrate holidays. One might imagine that such proximity fostered resentment more than camaraderie, and in many cases, it did. Yet Soviet citizens learned to live within these contradictions. Friendships within communalkas could be lifelong, strengthened by the shared memory of enduring daily frustrations together. Even disputes became part of the peculiar fabric of Soviet life, remembered with equal parts bitterness and humor. Beyond the home, social life spilled into workplaces, schools, and public spaces. Offices and factories were not merely sites of labor. They were arenas for camaraderie, gossip, and quiet rebellion against monotony. Co-workers celebrated birthdays with makeshift parties, pooled money for gifts, and drank vodka in break rooms. Bonds formed in these spaces were crucial, for colleagues could cover for you if you needed time off, or quietly help you navigate bureaucratic hurdles. Of course, the state attempted to shape friendships and community life to its own ends. Youth organizations like the Young Pioneers in Komsomol structured children's and adolescent social worlds, embedding ideology into play and leisure. Adults were encouraged to participate in trade unions, neighborhood committees, and party activities, yet within these official structures, people carved out genuine friendships. Even at a mandatory meeting or a staged parade, a smile exchanged with a friend or a shared grumble about shortages created bonds that transcended ideology. Scarcity, more than anything else, defined the need for community. Official shops were notorious for empty shelves. Citizens queued for hours, often with no guarantee of success. The queue itself became a social institution, a place where strangers commiserated, exchanged news, and sometimes even became friends. Stories abounded of people holding places in line for neighbors, or mothers sending their children to stand for hours with ration coupons. But queues alone could not sustain life. To truly survive, citizens turned to the shadow economy, the black market, known colloquially as Blatt. This network of favors and unofficial exchanges filled the gaps left by the state. Need a pair of jeans, a bottle of imported perfume, or fresh oranges for New Year's? You wouldn't find them in stores, but perhaps a friend of a friend knew someone who worked at the docks, or whose cousin traveled abroad, or who had access to restricted supply chains. Blatt was not only about illegal goods, it extended to services, paperwork, and privileges. A doctor might agree to see you sooner if you brought a gift. A teacher might overlook a missed assignment if you had family connections. Access to scarce resources was mediated through relationships, gifts, and quiet negotiations. It was not openly spoken of, yet everyone knew it existed. The irony was striking. In a system built on equality, inequality thrived in the shadows, determined not by wealth alone, but by the strength of one's social web. These informal systems of exchange did not just provide material goods, they provided dignity. A parent could dress their child in something special for a school performance. A family could serve real fruit at a holiday table. These small victories, gained through whispered favors and secret deals, became sources of pride. Despite the hardships, rituals of leisure and joy survived. People gathered in kitchens not only to eat, but to sing songs with a guitar, to recite poetry, or to debate politics in hushed tones. Courtyards filled with neighbors celebrating weddings or birthdays, bringing tables outside and toasting under. The open sky, bathhouses, banyas remained a treasured tradition where men and women gathered separately, sweating out the week's frustrations and bonding through ritual. Community was also built through shared cultural experiences. Cinema was hugely popular. Queues snaked around blocks for tickets to Soviet and occasionally foreign films. Concerts, theater performances, and literature circles became spaces where citizens connected not just to art, but to one another. In a society that often demanded conformity, these moments allowed for a glimpse of individuality and creativity, and of course, vodka was ever present. It was not simply a drink, but a social glue. Toasts marked every gathering, from somber funerals to joyous birthdays. A bottle of vodka could smooth tensions in a communalka, seal a black market exchange, or serve as a gesture of goodwill to a neighbor. It was a ritual, binding people together in shared vulnerability. In truth, ordinary Soviet life was less about isolation under an oppressive system and more about the webs of community woven to withstand it. Friendship, neighborly ties, and informal exchanges turned what could have been unbearable hardship into something survivable, even meaningful. These relationships carried risks. Trusting the wrong person could lead to betrayal, especially in a society where surveillance and informants were a constant reality. Yet for most, the gamble was worth it. Life was richer, warmer, and more human when lived alongside others. When one thinks of the Soviet Union, it is easy to imagine only the grayness of its architecture or the sternness of its leaders. But in the courtyards, kitchens, and bathhouses, another story unfolded, a story of resilience, humor, and quiet acts of kindness. A neighbor slipping you a piece of sausage, a friend saving your place in line, a whispered joke told at just the right moment. These small gestures were the threads that held the social fabric together. The paradox of Soviet life was that while the state sought to control every aspect of existence, it inadvertently fostered a society where people depended more on each other than ever. The shortages, the queues, the communal apartments all forced citizens into intimacy. And from that intimacy grew friendships of extraordinary depth and resilience. This was ordinary life in the Soviet Union, frustrating, exhausting, often absurd, yet filled with the laughter of neighbors, the warmth of friendships, and the subtle triumphs of human connection. If family and friendship formed the private pillars of Soviet existence, then work was the public stage where life unfolded. Every Soviet citizen, whether they were a farmer, factory worker, teacher, or engineer, was expected to contribute to the collective labor that defined the nation. Officially, work was more than a job, it was a duty, a patriotic contribution to the great project of socialism. Yet in practice, the daily reality of labor in the Soviet Union was far more complex, marked by contradictions, frustrations, and unexpected joys. Factories were the heart of Soviet industry, and they pulsed with the sounds of machines, the clatter of tools, and the shouts of foremen. The Soviet Union prided itself on its ability to produce steel, coal, tractors, tanks, textiles, shoes, radios. Posters showed smiling workers in gleaming uniforms, operating perfectly efficient machines. But in reality, factories were often chaotic and undersupplied. Workers might arrive at their station only to find they lacked the parts needed to complete their quota. Tools were worn out, safety standards lax, and electricity outages common. Still, Soviet workers adapted. Improvisation was a skill as valuable as technical knowledge. If a machine broke down, it might be patched together with spare parts scavenged from somewhere else. If paint was missing, workers might borrow it from a neighboring shop. Quotas, the ever-present measure of productivity, had to be met, and managers often pressured workers to find creative ways to meet them, sometimes fudging numbers, sometimes working late into the night. For many, the workplace was less about production and more about survival. Factories provided not only wages, but also housing, childcare, and even access to scarce goods. A worker with a good relationship with their foreman might gain privileges, such as access to better apartments or the chance to travel for work. In this way, one's career was deeply entangled with every other aspect of life. Yet it would be misleading to paint work only as drudgery. Factories, offices, and collective farms were social spaces as much as economic ones. Break rooms filled with chatter, jokes, and songs. Birthdays were celebrated with shared meals and vodka hidden in teacups. Friendships and even romances blossomed on factory floors and in office corridors. For women, who made up a significant portion of the workforce, the workplace was both an opportunity and a burden. They were expected to balance full-time employment with household duties, often shouldering a double shift of labor at work and at home. Yet, many women also gained independence, respect, and community from their professional roles. Education and professions offered another layer of Soviet work life. Becoming a doctor, teacher, engineer, or scientist was considered not only an individual achievement, but a victory for the collective. Students studied under immense pressure, often in poorly supplied classrooms. But education was free, and higher learning offered social prestige. A doctor's office might lack basic medicines, but doctors themselves were respected, often seen as guardians of community health. Teachers, too, carried immense responsibility, shaping not only knowledge, but ideology in the next generation. Still, whether one was a teacher in a village school or an engineer in Moscow, bureaucracy loomed large. The Soviet system thrived on paperwork in less forms, stamps, and approvals. A simple request for leave might require multiple signatures. To acquire housing or even a new ration card could take weeks of navigating offices and officials. Standing in lines was not limited to grocery stores. Citizens queued at government buildings as well, clutching documents and hoping their request would not be denied. This bureaucracy was frustrating, yet it also became a shared cultural experience. Jokes about bureaucrats, low, lazy, endlessly stamping papers circulated widely. People learned tricks, how to phrase a request to get a faster response, whom to bribe with a bottle of vodka or a box of chocolates. which clerk could be relied upon to lose inconvenient paperwork. In this way, the very inefficiencies of the system became part of ordinary life, shaping how people navigated their daily existence. For those on collective farms, work was even more grueling. Long hours in fields, often with outdated equipment, defined rural labor. Collective farmers were expected to meet production targets, but poor planning, weather conditions, and lack of resources meant these goals were often unrealistic. Despite this, peasants still found ways to grow food for themselves, often on small personal garden plots. These private plots, though tiny compared to state farmland, produced a significant portion of the nation's vegetables and meat. For many families, they were the difference between hunger and survival. Work was also tied to ritual and celebration. Every year, the state organized massive parades on May Day and other holidays, celebrating the achievements of labor. Workers marched in formation, carrying banners and portraits of leaders, their faces tired yet proud. Factories were decorated with slogans proclaiming record outputs, whether true or not. These spectacles served to remind citizens of their supposed central role in the great socialist project, even if daily life often felt disconnected from such grand ideals. And yet, beneath the slogans and the bureaucracy, work could also be deeply human. A miner might take pride in extracting coal that warmed his city. A teacher might see the spark of curiosity in a child's eyes. A doctor might find fulfillment in healing patients despite shortages. These moments, though fleeting, gave meaning to lives otherwise constrained by the rigid structures of the system. Leisure was intertwined with work, too. Workers, unions, organized trips to sanatoriums, rest homes, where citizens could recover from the strains of labor. These were coveted opportunities, offering access to fresh air, good food, and medical treatments. For a few weeks, ordinary citizens could escape the grind of the factory or the office, returning home with stories of the sea or the mountains. Travel for work was another source of both burden and adventure. A factory assignment might send a worker across the country, from Moscow to Siberia, from Leningrad to Central Asia. These journeys exposed citizens to the vastness of their nation, to new cultures and landscapes. Though travel was often exhausting, it could also be exhilarating, broadening horizons in ways few other experiences could. At the heart of it all, Soviet work life was marked by contradictions. Officially, every worker was a hero of socialism, contributing to a collective dream. In reality, workers often felt like cogs in a dysfunctional machine. Yet through resilience, humor, and community, they made that machine bearable. They learned to navigate shortages, to bend rules, to find pride in small victories. Work was not just a duty, but a stage on which ordinary Soviet citizens enacted their creativity, perseverance, and humanity. Ordinary life in the Soviet Union cannot be understood without seeing this duality, the drudgery of quotas and bureaucracy alongside the laughter of friends at a factory table, the frustration of broken machines alongside the pride of completing a difficult task, the exhaustion of labor balanced by the joy of a sanatorium holiday or a shared song at the end of a shift. Work, like every aspect of Soviet existence, was complicated, contradictory, and deeply human. If work defined the public face of Soviet life, then housing defined the private one. Where you lived, how much space you had, and who shared your walls shaped your daily rhythms as much as your job. Yet, in the Soviet Union, housing was never just a personal concern. It was a political, economic, and cultural battleground. For much of the 20th century, the Soviet Union faced an overwhelming housing shortage. Industrialization and war had left millions without adequate homes, forcing families to live in cramped, dilapidated buildings. In cities, this often meant communalkas, or communal apartments, massive, subdivided flats where multiple families lived together. Each family had a single room that served as bedroom, living room, and sometimes kitchen. Bathrooms, kitchens, and hallways were shared. Life in a communalka was a constant negotiation. Families competed for refrigerator space, for use of the stove, for hot water. Privacy was scarce, and thin walls carried every argument, lullaby, or secret across to neighbors. Petty conflicts over cleanliness or noise could stretch on for years. Yet despite the tension, communal living also created bonds. Neighbors often became like extended family, sharing food, babysitting, or celebrating holidays together. Children grew up in tight-knit corridors, learning early the art of compromise and the value of community. By the mid-20th century, the state sought to address the housing crisis through massive construction programs. The most famous result was the Khrushchevka type of standardized, prefabricated apartment building introduced under Nikita Khrushchev. These buildings were plain, boxy, and often criticized as soulless, but to many Soviet families they were a dream come true. For the first time, they had their own kitchen, bathroom, and front door. Moving from a communalka to a private apartment symbolized progress, independence, and dignity. Inside these apartments, life was modest but functional. Furniture was often state-issued or mass-produced, giving many homes a similar look. Wooden cabinets, patterned rugs hung on the wall for insulation and decoration, a sturdy table at the center of family life. Televisions, when they became available, were placed in the living room, turning evening news broadcasts or state-approved films into communal rituals. Despite shortages, families decorated their homes with whatever they could find: handmade crafts, black and white family photographs, or souvenirs from rare travels. Consumer culture in the Soviet Union was a strange paradox. On paper, the state promised to provide for all citizens. In reality, shortages plagued everyday life. Simple goods, soap, meat, or even toilet paper were often hard to come by. To acquire them, Soviet citizens became masters of the queue. Standing in line was not an occasional annoyance, but a defining feature of daily life. A line stretching down a block might indicate a shipment of oranges had arrived, or that a new batch of winter coats was being distributed. People would rush to join, sometimes without even knowing what was being sold. Queues became social spaces, filled with gossip, complaints, and camaraderie. Strangers chatted about politics, weather, or family news while inching forward. At times, waiting could last hours, even days. Parents brought children to help hold spots, and neighbors saved each other's places. Stories circulated of fights breaking out, of people fainting from exhaustion, of triumphant joy when a scarce item was finally acquired. These lines, frustrating though they were, became part of the collective memory of Soviet life. Behind the shortages lay the hidden economy. Officially, everything was distributed through state channels. Unofficially, a web of favors, bribes, and connections known as black oiled the gears of daily existence. A doctor might secure scarce medicine in exchange for a bottle of cognac. A shop clerk could slip a coveted pair of boots to a friend who would help them secure a vacation pass. This informal system blurred the lines between legality and survival, making personal networks as valuable as money itself. Fashion, too, was a mix of scarcity and creativity. Western styles were admired but not easily available. Jeans, for example, became a symbol of youth, rebellion, and modernity, yet they were nearly impossible to find in Soviet stores. Those who managed to acquire a pair through relatives abroad, smugglers, or black market deals, wore them proudly, even patching them repeatedly to make them last. Women improvised with sewing machines, transforming curtains or bedspreads into dresses. Magazines provided patterns, and resourceful citizens gave new life to old clothes, while official fashion emphasized modesty and uniformity. Individual expression always found its way through. Holidays offered brief relief from the grind of shortages and labor. Some were deeply political: May Day parades with their red banners, and mass demonstrations reinforced the image of workers as the backbone of the state. Others were more personal, like New Year's, which replaced Christmas as the most cherished celebration after religion was officially discouraged. Families decorated fir trees, exchanged small gifts, and gathered for meals of whatever delicacies they could find. Even in times of scarcity, tables were adorned with salads, breads, and sweets, lovingly prepared and carefully rationed for children. New Year's brought the figure of dead Moreau's grandfather, Frost, who delivered gifts, much like Santa Claus in the West. Dressed in a long robe, accompanied by his granddaughter Sneguroshka, he became a symbol of joy in an otherwise austere world. Schools and community centers staged holiday plays, giving children a chance to perform, sing, and forget for a moment the hardships of daily life. Religious holidays, though officially suppressed, were quietly observed in many households. Easter eggs were painted in secret, church bells still rang in villages, and weddings often carried traditional rituals alongside official ceremonies. The tension between ideology and tradition shaped much of Soviet domestic life, as families balanced public conformity with private devotion. Housing queues and holidays reveal a deeper truth about ordinary Soviet existence, that people constantly negotiated between scarcity and abundance, between official ideology and personal needs. Life was never easy, but it was lived with resilience and creativity. Evenings at home offered their own rhythms. Families gathered around radios or televisions, listening to state-approved music or watching broadcasts of ballet, sports, or political speeches. Children did homework by dim light while parents prepared meals, repaired clothing, or read newspapers. Despite shortages, homes were filled with warmth, with the chatter of voices, the smell of soup simmering, the sound of a neighbor knocking on the door. This domestic world, shaped by state policies yet enriched by personal effort, gave Soviet citizens a sense of stability amid uncertainty. Whether in cramped communalkas or modest khrushchevkas, homes were havens where people could laugh, dream, and love even as they navigated the complexities of a system that often failed to meet their needs. If work and housing framed the structure of everyday life, then leisure and entertainment provided the escape valves. In the Soviet Union, what you did after hours mattered not only to your sense of happiness, but also to the state, which kept a close watch on how citizens spent their free time. Leisure, like labor, was infused with ideology. Yet between official parades and censored films, people found their own ways to unwind, to laugh, and to carve out spaces of joy. Public entertainment often revolved around state-approved activities. Cinemas, for instance, dotted nearly every city, offering films that ranged from patriotic war epics to moral tales about workers and farmers. Tickets were inexpensive, and a night at the movies was a beloved outing for families, couples, and groups of friends. While censorship restricted the content, Soviet directors often found creative ways to smuggle humor, satire, or subtle critique into their films. Popular comedies, like those of Leonid Gudai, became cultural touchstones, quoted endlessly by audiences, who recognized themselves in the bumbling yet resourceful characters. Theater occupied a more elevated place in Soviet culture. Moscow's Bolshoi Theater and St. Petersburg's Mariinsky were world-renowned, drawing audiences with performances of ballet, opera, and drama. Yet beyond these elite stages, countless local theaters offered plays rooted in folk traditions, literature, or socialist themes. Attending the theater was not only an artistic experience, but a social one. People dressed formally, discussed the performances with friends, and absorbed the subtle messages woven into the scripts. Music, too, carried both official and underground. Current state-approved orchestras and choirs filled grand halls with classical works and patriotic songs. Folk ensembles preserved regional traditions, often reimagined to fit socialist ideals. Yet younger generations longed for something different. By the 1960s and 70s, Western rock and roll and jazz filtered through radio waves, smuggled records, and word-of-mouth networks. Listening to the Beatles or Led Zeppelin in a cramped apartment became an act of rebellion, a whispered defiance against cultural conformity. Homemade recordings, pressed onto discarded X-ray films, and nicknamed Bones music, circulated secretly, giving Soviet youth a taste of forbidden rhythms. Nightlife, in the Western sense, was limited. Bars, as seen in capitalist cities, were rare, and restaurants were often expensive or reserved for special occasions. Instead, social life thrived in private apartments. Friends gathered for večírky in formal evening parties where food, drink, and conversation flowed freely. Someone might bring a guitar, and soon the room would be filled with songs, folk ballads, bardic poetry, or improvised verses. These gatherings, though modest, offered a freedom that public spaces could not. Here, in smoky kitchens, with glasses of homemade wine or vodka, people debated politics, shared jokes, and dreamed of futures beyond their immediate reach. Alcohol, especially vodka, played a central role in social life. It was both a celebratory drink and a coping mechanism, a way to endure the frustrations of shortages and bureaucracy. Toasts punctuated every gathering, often elaborate and heartfelt. Drinking rituals emphasized camaraderie and loyalty, binding people together through shared laughter and, sometimes, shared sorrow. While the state occasionally launched campaigns against excessive drinking, vodka remained deeply embedded in the culture. Sports provided another outlet for collective joy. From the local soccer fields to the grand arenas of Moscow, athletic competitions stirred pride and unity. Ice hockey, in particular, became a symbol of Soviet strength, especially when the national team triumphed against Western rivals. Children were encouraged to join sports clubs, not only for health, but as part of the ideological emphasis on discipline, teamwork, and collective achievement. For many families, weekends meant attending matches, cheering on local teams, or gathering around radios to follow scores. Travel within the Soviet Union was tightly regulated, but it was nonetheless a cherished form of leisure. The state organized Pertovki vacation vouchers for workers, granting them access to sanatoriums by the Black Sea, resorts in the Caucasus, or rest homes in the countryside. These trips were not luxurious by Western standards, but for Soviet citizens, they represented a rare chance to relax, breathe fresh air, and step away from the grind of factory or office life. Sanatoriums combined medical treatments with leisure, offering massages, mineral baths, and prescribed walks along the seaside. For those unable to secure such vouchers, Docha's small country cottages offered an alternative. Many urban families had access to modest plots of land outside the city where they grew vegetables, tended fruit trees, and escaped the concrete monotony of apartment blocks. Summer weekends at the Dacha meant sunbathing, fishing, or gathering around outdoor tables for long meals. Children roamed fields, collected berries, and built forts, while adults enjoyed the relative peace of rural life. These humble retreats became central to Soviet identity, shaping cherished memories for generations. Books were perhaps the most enduring form of entertainment. The Soviet Union prided itself on being a nation of readers, and libraries were plentiful. While censorship limited what was officially published, literature retained a unique power. Classic works of Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, and Pushkin were widely available, alongside contemporary authors who navigated the boundaries of acceptability. For many, reading offered both education and escape, a way to travel beyond the confines of their surroundings. Samizdat self-published, illegal manuscripts circulated hand to hand, carrying banned works that spoke truths people longed to. Here, possessing such literature was risky, but the hunger for words was stronger than fear. Television, by the mid-20th century, became a central fixture of leisure. With limited channels, programming included news broadcasts, cultural performances, children's shows, and state-approved films. Families gathered each evening around the screen, their apartments illuminated by flickering images. Iconic shows like New Pagodi, a slapstick cartoon about a wolf chasing a hare, captured the imagination of children and adults alike. Though propaganda was always present, television also created shared cultural references, weaving together a population spread across 11 time zones. Beyond official entertainment, humor itself became a survival strategy. Jokes and anecdotes circulated widely, poking fun at bureaucracy, shortages, and political leaders. Though risky, these jokes created solidarity, a quiet resistance wrapped in laughter. One popular quip asked, "Why do Soviet shops only sell black bread?" "Because it hides the dirt better." Such humor lightened the heaviness of daily struggles, offering a momentary reprieve from the absurdities of the system. Even leisure activities reflected the dual nature of Soviet life, officially structured, yet constantly reinterpreted by citizens. Parades and state celebrations projected unity and ideological zeal, but behind closed doors, in kitchens and dochas, people found personal joy, intimacy, and authenticity. Entertainment, in its many forms, revealed the resilience of a population determined to find meaning beyond slogans. To understand the Soviet Union, one must look not only at its factories and ministries, but also at its dance floors, picnic blankets, and kitchen tables. Here, amid music, laughter, and quiet acts of defiance, ordinary people built lives of surprising richness. The Soviet Union often presented itself as a society without shadows, a place where everything existed under the bright, equalizing light of socialism. But beneath this carefully controlled brightness, entire worlds of unspoken rules, hidden transactions, and private beliefs thrived. While the official image of leisure and culture was one of parades, patriotic films, and state festivals, many citizens slipped quietly into other realities that did not always align with the official script. these hidden dimensions of life, black markets, underground art, whispered religion, were as much a part of Soviet existence as the May Day banners or portraits of Lenin that lined the boulevards. The black market, or fartsovka, existed because of scarcity. Shops frequently lacked basic goods, and when they did stock something desirable, the lines stretched for blocks. Standing in queues became a kind of secondary occupation for millions. Women might leave home at dawn to secure a place in line for butter or shoes, while men used connections at work to access goods through back channels. Out of these shortages grew a parallel economy. If a store clerk had access to extra pairs of imported jeans, they could vanish into the hands of speculators, who resold them at 10 times their official price. Western cigarettes, nylon stockings, or foreign records became currency in their own right. Students sometimes smuggled Levi's from abroad, carefully folded in suitcases, knowing that owning a pair meant not only fashion but status. A quiet rebellion stitched in denim. Money alone could not always secure what one wanted. Far more often, it was connectionsblatt that made the difference. A neighbor who worked in a bakery could slip a family an extra loaf. A cousin in a meat factory might secure a cut of pork when shops were empty. A friend in the Ministry of Trade could arrange a voucher for a sanatorium. These networks were unofficial yet essential, and every Soviet household leaned on them. The state called it corruption, but for ordinary people it was survival, an unwritten system of favors and reciprocities that filled the gaps left by the planned economy, just as the black market filled material voids. Underground art filled cultural ones. Official galleries were dominated by socialist realism, a style that depicted radiant workers, heroic soldiers, and smiling peasants under the benevolent gaze of party leaders. Paintings glowed with idealized strength and optimism, but behind closed doors, artists experimented with abstraction, surrealism, and expressionism. Their works rarely saw the light of official exhibition halls. Instead, they circulated in private apartments, rolled up and shown to trusted friends or sympathetic collectors. Sometimes, exhibitions were held in secret, with invitations whispered rather than printed, the risk of discovery hanging in the air. Writers faced similar challenges. Soviet publishing houses operated under strict censorship, and every manuscript was scrutinized for ideological purity. Yet writers continued to push boundaries. Some cloaked their critiques in allegory, embedding dissent in fables and metaphors that passed beneath the censor's gaze. Others turned to sumizdat, the underground circulation of typewritten manuscripts. Each copy was created by hand, often using carbon paper, and passed from reader to reader. The novels of Alexander Solzhenitsyn or the poetry of Anna Akhmatova lived on in this way, fragile sheets of paper that carried immense weight. To possess such writings was to take a risk, but it was also to feel a rare sense of truth. Music, too, had its underground. Official culture celebrated patriotic anthems and folk songs reshaped for socialist ideals. But in kitchens and dormitories, something different played. Western rock and roll, forbidden yet irresistible, was smuggled in through radio signals. Contraband tapes, or the ingenious practice of recording on discarded X-ray plates, which produced ghostly, crackling discs known as ribs or bones. Young people treasured these recordings, huddling around record players to hear forbidden rhythms. To listen to the Beatles in Leningrad or Black Sabbath in Moscow was to feel connected to a wider world, to a cultural current flowing beyond the walls of censorship. Religion survived in much the same wake, quietly, stubbornly, often invisibly. The Soviet Union declared itself a secular state, and official propaganda dismissed faith as a relic of the past. Churches were closed, turned into warehouses or museums of atheism. Priests were watched, and open displays of belief could cost someone their career. Yet faith persisted, carried in whispers and rituals passed down through families. Grandmothers lit candles in secret, whispered prayers over their grandchildren, and celebrated Easter behind closed curtains. In rural villages, small wooden churches continued to hold services, the congregations entering discreetly, careful to avoid drawing attention. For many, faith was less about theology and more about memory and identity, a link to ancestors and traditions that no decree could erase. Even public entertainment sometimes carried private meanings. A parade, for example, looked like a celebration of state power, with red banners fluttering and slogans shouted in unison. But within the crowd, people might interpret the event differently. Some genuinely believed, their hearts swelling with pride as tanks rumbled past. Others marched because it was required, feet moving mechanically, minds drifting elsewhere. Some laughed privately at the absurdity of it all, exchanging quiet jokes that cut through the spectacle. The same event could mean loyalty, obedience, or resistance, depending on the eyes that watched it. Everyday survival required learning to live in these parallel worlds. Officially, one might quote Marx or Lenin, attend meetings, and hang portraits of party leaders. Privately, one might trade for Western cigarettes, read banned novels by candlelight, or laugh at a political joke whispered at a kitchen table. The kitchen, in fact, became one of the most important spaces in Soviet life. In cramped apartments, it was the one place where friends could gather, pour vodka, and speak more freely than anywhere else. Conversations stretched late into the night, ranging from art and philosophy to the daily absurdities of Soviet life. The clatter of plates, the warmth of a stove, and the presence of trusted companions created a fragile sense of freedom. It was in these kitchens that jokes, the famous anecdotes circulated. They were more than entertainment. They were a release valve, a coded language of resistance. A popular one asked, "Why is the future certain but the past always changing?" Because in the Soviet Union, it is easier to predict tomorrow than to be sure of yesterday. Such jokes mocked bureaucracy, shortages, and the cult of personality, giving people a way to express what could not be said directly. Laughter itself became a kind of shield, protecting the spirit against despair. Despite the restrictions, many Soviet citizens managed to create lives filled with meaning. Weddings, for instance, were celebrated with remarkable joy. Even when supplies were scarce, families pooled resources to create feasts. Long tables groaned under homemade dishes, pickled vegetables, roasted meats, salads drenched in mayonnaise, loaves of dark bread, and of course, vodka. Music played, toasts were raised, and the dancing went on until morning. Birthdays and name days, too, were opportunities for celebration, often spilling out of tiny apartments as neighbors joined the festivities. These events reminded people that even in a system designed to flatten individuality, human connections and rituals remained vibrant. For children, childhood was both structured and magical. Official youth organizations, like the Young Pioneers, instilled loyalty to the party through uniforms, badges, and ceremonies. Yet outside those rituals, children played in courtyards, inventing games with sticks and scraps, sledding in winter, and swimming in rivers during the summer. They devoured books, watched cartoons, and dreamed of space travel, inspired by the cosmonauts who were hailed as heroes. To a child, the shortages and politics mattered less than the thrill of climbing a tree, catching snowflakes, or watching fireworks explode against the night sky. Life in the Soviet Union, then, was never only what the state proclaimed it to be. It was layered, contradictory, filled with both hardship and resilience. The black markets, the underground art, the whispered prayers, the kitchen conversations, all of these revealed a population that refused to be entirely defined by ideology. Official culture projected one version of reality, but ordinary people lived another, weaving together small freedoms, quiet acts of defiance, and moments of joy into something resembling a full life. And this duality was perhaps the most defining feature of Soviet existence, the ability to navigate between what was said and what was meant, between what was public and what was private, between what was allowed and what was truly lived. In that space between the lines, millions of lives unfolded, ordinary, complex, and unforgettable. Fashion in the Soviet Union existed in a strange tension between ideology and desire. The official message stressed uniformity. Workers' clothing should be practical, modest, and affordable, free from the extravagance of capitalist fashion houses. Yet the human desire to express beauty and individuality could not be erased by doctrine. Across the country, women sewed dresses from scraps of fabric, adjusting patterns found in magazines or passed between friends. Scarves became a staple, adding color to otherwise plain outfits, while carefully chosen belts, brooches, or even brightly polished shoes allowed a woman to stand out without appearing openly rebellious. For men, clothing was more straightforward, often consisting of simple suits, shirts, and heavy coats for the brutal winters. But even here, differences crept in. A leather jacket imported from the West or more commonly acquired through black market. Deals could transform a man into a figure of envy among his peers. Youth culture especially latched onto fashion as a subtle form of defiance. Teenagers dreamed of Western jeans, brightly patterned shirts, or sneakers unlike the dull Soviet designs. A young man who managed to get his hands on a pair of Levi's instantly became the center of attention, walking proof that even in a society that claimed to reject consumerism, clothing could symbolize freedom. Gender roles in Soviet life were equally complex. Official propaganda praised women as equal contributors to socialism, showing posters of female factory workers, tractor drivers, and scientists alongside men. And indeed, women participated widely in the workforce, often balancing demanding jobs with family responsibilities. But equality in theory did not mean equality in practice. While women carried the burden of labor outside the home, they were also expected to manage domestic life, cooking meals, cleaning apartments, and raising children. The so-called double shift became an unspoken reality for millions. Men were praised for their contribution to industry or the military, but few were expected to share equally in housework. Family life revolved around small apartments, often shared between multiple generations. A grandmother might live in the same 2 rooms as her children and grandchildren, weaving traditions into the fabric of daily life. She would pass down recipes, lullabies, and stories that outlasted the political rhetoric of the day. In this way, culture was preserved not through official textbooks, but through whispered advice over tea, through the way dumplings were folded or the manner in which Easter eggs were dyed in onion skins. The intimacy of such arrangements meant that family bonds were tight, but privacy was almost non-existent. A child grew up overhearing adult conversations, absorbing both caution and resilience. Education formed another cornerstone of Soviet existence, a system both admired and feared. Schools emphasized discipline and ideological loyalty, but they also provided a high standard of scientific and mathematical training. Children began the day with patriotic rituals, singing songs that praised Lenin and the party. Their textbooks celebrated socialist heroes while minimizing the contributions of outsiders, carefully shaping historical memory. Yet beyond ideology, the curriculum trained generations of skilled mathematicians, engineers, and doctors. Homework was heavy and expectations were high. Parents often hovered close to ensure children succeeded, since education was seen as the surest path to advancement. In a society where other routes were blocked, universities carried their own peculiar dynamics. To gain entry, students needed not only good grades, but also a clean political record. A family tainted by association with religion, descent, or foreign ties might see their child's chances evaporate, no matter how bright they were. For those who did make it into higher education, life was a mixture of strict control and youthful exploration. Dormitories bustled with energy. Students debated philosophy late into the night, experimented with music and art, and quietly tested boundaries. A professor might officially lecture on Marxist-Leninist theory, but over tea he might also slip in references to Aristotle, Kant, or Freud, names not always encouraged in public discourse. Generational differences shaped the texture of ordinary life in powerful ways. Those who had lived through the Revolution or the Second World War tended to prize stability, having endured chaos and devastation in their youth. To them, the Soviet Union, even with its shortages and restrictions, security. The younger generations, raised in an atmosphere of state triumphalism, often viewed things differently. They were less content with the limitations of everyday life, more curious about the outside world, more eager to adopt Western music, fashion, or attitudes. This generational tension simmered quietly within families, surfacing in arguments about proper dress, acceptable friends, or the wisdom of attending underground concerts. Despite these differences, certain experiences bound all generations together. Summer vacations in the countryside were one such tradition. Every year, families fled cramped apartments for Dochas small summer houses, often simple wooden structures without running water. Here, life slowed down. Children picked berries, grandparents tended vegetable gardens, and evenings were spent around campfires, singing folk songs or telling stories. These dacha summers became the backdrop of countless childhood memories, a reminder that beyond the state's heavy presence, ordinary joys still existed. Fresh cucumbers eaten straight from the vine, the earthy smell of rain on soil, the laughter of cousins running barefoot through the grass. Food culture reflected both scarcity and ingenuity. Officially, Soviet diets were supposed to be nutritious and balanced, with state cookbooks prescribing simple meals of porridge, soups, and boiled meats. But in practice, creativity was necessary to make meals exciting. Housewives invented recipes. With whatever was available, herring layered with beets became the famous salad herring under a fur coat. Mayonnaise transformed humble vegetables into celebratory dishes, and pickling ensured that cabbages, cucumbers, and tomatoes could last through the long winters. Holidays inspired special efforts. Dumplings for New Year's, Easter cakes secretly baked in some homes, lavish spreads for weddings. Sharing food was not just about sustenance, but about signaling care, creating warmth in an otherwise cold world. Entertainment and leisure also shaped the rhythm of life. Official theaters staged approved plays, and cinemas screened patriotic films, but Soviet citizens found ways to seek out what truly moved them. Classics like Tolstoy and Chekhov remained beloved, providing depth beyond propaganda. The ballet and opera offered genuine brilliance, where artistry transcended politics, and tickets were coveted treasures. Meanwhile, millions gathered around radios in the evenings, listening not only to state broadcasts, but also to faint, forbidden signals from abroad. Young people risked punishment by tuning into Voice of America or the BBC, hungry for perspectives that were otherwise out of reach. Sports offered another shared passion. The Soviet state invested heavily in athletic programs, seeing them as a way to showcase the superiority of socialism. Children were trained in gymnastics, hockey, weightlifting, and track, often from a very young age. International competitions became stages for national pride, and victories were celebrated as triumphs of the entire system. Yet beyond the political symbolism, ordinary citizens embraced sports as genuine enjoyment. Families skied in the winter, swam in rivers during summer, and filled stadiums to cheer for local teams. Even the smallest village might have a soccer field, where children kicked makeshift balls until nightfall. Underlying all of this was the constant presence of the state, a reminder that no aspect of life was entirely free from oversight. The KGB's shadow loomed, ensuring that loyalty was maintained and dissent was swiftly silenced. Yet people learned to navigate this reality with remarkable adaptability. They developed the habit of speaking cautiously in public, reserving honest opinions for trusted friends behind closed doors. Children were taught from a young age to avoid repeating everything they heard at home for fear of endangering their families. Over time, this created a culture of coded language, where meaning often lay in what was not said, in gestures and silences as much as in words. And yet, in the midst of these constraints, people carved out lives that were rich, layered, and deeply human. They fell in love, wrote poetry, celebrated births, mourned losses, and dreamed of futures both within and beyond the Soviet system. The paradox of Soviet life was that even in a society built on uniformity, individuality found ways to bloom. A grandmother humming an old folk song while kneading dough. A young student sketching forbidden modernist designs in the margins of his notebook. A father secretly fixing a broken radio so his children could hear foreign music. These quiet acts added texture to the grey facade of ideology. What emerges, when we look closely, is not a monolithic society, but a mosaic of experiences. Officially, everyone was a worker, a comrade, a loyal citizen. In reality, each person navigated the contradictions in their own way, balancing compliance with creativity, survival with small freedoms. The Soviet Union may have been defined by its slogans and its institutions, but the essence of ordinary life was found elsewhere, in kitchens crowded with laughter, in gardens where children played, in friendships sustained through hardship, and in the silent determination to live fully even when the world demanded restraint. Work formed the backbone of life in the Soviet Union. It was not just a means of survival, but the very foundation of identity, the lens through which a person was valued. Official slogans declared the worker to be the hero of society, and portraits of strong, smiling men and women hung on factory walls as examples of socialist virtue. From dawn until dusk, factories buzzed, farms labored, offices processed endless paperwork, and the hum of industry became the background sound of the nation. Yet behind the posters and speeches, ordinary work was often monotonous, exhausting, and burdened by shortages and inefficiency. In factories, workers toiled under the pressure of production quotas, targets set by central planners who often knew little of the realities on the ground. Machines broke down frequently, spare parts were scarce, and yet managers pushed employees to meet numbers on paper. This gave rise to what many called storming, the frantic rush to finish production. At the end of each month, with employees working long hours to fulfill quotas that had been neglected in the weeks prior. The result was often chaos, hurried products, shoddy quality, and exhausted bodies. Yet even amidst these pressures, pride could be found. A worker who managed to produce beyond expectations might be awarded with recognition, a red banner pinned to the wall, or even a modest prize such as a new appliance. For farmers, life was no less demanding. Collectivization had long since transformed agriculture, and workers in collective farms faced unpredictable harvests, outdated equipment, and the whims of weather. Still, many families maintained small private plots, tiny sections of land allowed by the state where they could grow vegetables or keep a few animals. These private plots often produced more food than the collective fields and became essential for survival. A family's potatoes, cucumbers, or cabbages might mean the difference between abundance and hunger during the long winters. Market days in rural areas were filled with these small exchanges, with people bartering or selling surplus, produced despite the official emphasis on collective farming. Travel within the Soviet Union was a strange mixture of restriction and possibility. On one hand, the vastness of the country offered endless landscapes, forests stretching beyond the horizon, mountains dusted with snow, rivers winding like silver veins. On the other hand, the logistics of moving through this space were often difficult. Trains were the lifeline, connecting cities and towns, carrying both passengers and goods. A journey on the Trans-Siberian Railway, for instance, could take days, with travelers packed into compartments where samovars boiled tea and strangers swapped stories over shared bread and sausage. These trips were long, tiring, but strangely communal, a microcosm of Soviet society moving along steel rails. International travel, however, was a luxury reserved for the very few. To leave the Soviet Union required permissions that were nearly impossible for ordinary citizens to obtain. Most people never saw another country in their lifetime. Instead, travel within the borders became the main form of exploration. Families took vacations to the Black Sea, where the warm waters of resorts in Crimea or Sochi provided relief from long winters. These seaside trips became the pinnacle of leisure, remembered fondly by those who experienced them. Children collected seashells, parents lounged on crowded beaches, and at night, boardwalks came alive with music and laughter. It was as close to paradise as many could imagine. Propaganda filled every corner of daily life, woven seamlessly into the fabric of the ordinary. Posters decorated streets, depicting cheerful farmers with overflowing baskets of grain, smiling cosmonauts reaching for the stars, and workers building a radiant future. Radios broadcast patriotic songs and speeches that praised the leadership, while newspapers delivered carefully crafted stories of triumphs, both real and exaggerated. Even the design of public spaces reflected ideology. Statues of Lenin stood in town squares, his gaze eternal, while murals portrayed scenes of solidarity and progress. These messages were inescapable, shaping how people saw themselves and their place in society. Yet propaganda was not always received with the enthusiasm intended. Many people learned to read between the lines, to smile politely at official slogans, while quietly doubting their truth. Humor became a form of resistance. Jokes known as anecdotes circulated widely, poking fun at the absurdities of the system. A man might quip about waiting in line for hours, only to discover that the store was selling nothing at all. Or laugh at the irony of being told his life had never been better while he patched the same coat for the 5th winter in a row. These jokes spread quickly, whispered in kitchens or shared discreetly at workplaces, offering a release valve for frustration. Healthcare was another pillar of ordinary existence, shaped by the same contradictions that defined much of Soviet life. In theory, medical care was free and accessible to all, a proud achievement of socialism. In practice, hospitals often suffered from shortages of medicine, outdated equipment, and overworked staff. Doctors and nurses did their best with what they had, improvising treatments when supplies ran out. Patients might wait in long lines for appointments, and many brought small gifts, flowers, chocolates, or coffee from medical staff as tokens of gratitude and to ensure better care. Despite these challenges, the Soviet healthcare system achieved remarkable successes, particularly in preventive care and vaccinations. Infant mortality rates dropped, life expectancy rose, and public health campaigns promoted hygiene and wellness. Daily life in hospitals revealed both hardship and humanity. A sick child might share a ward with half a dozen others, parents visiting during strict hours and bringing home-cooked food to supplement bland hospital meals. Elderly patients swapped stories as they recovered, while young doctors, fresh from university, carried both idealism and exhaustion. For many, illness became another space where resilience and kindness shone through. A nurse who stayed late to comfort a frightened patient, a family member who made endless trips on trams to bring supplies. Such acts softened the harsh edges of the system. The future, as imagined by Soviet citizens, was always painted in glowing colors by the state. Propaganda promised that tomorrow would be brighter, that communism was just around the corner, that scientific progress would deliver miracles. Magazines showcased futuristic cities, gleaming with glass towers and flying cars, where every worker lived in comfort and abundance. Schools taught children to believe in this radiant tomorrow, filling their imaginations with space colonies and technological marvels. And yet, the reality of broken elevators, leaking pipes, and bare shelves in grocery stores stood in sharp contrast to these promises. This gap between the official future and the lived present created a quiet disillusionment, one that grew steadily. As years passed, despite this, hope remained. People dreamed not only of official utopias, but also of personal futures. A larger apartment, a successful career for their children, a trip to the sea, a wedding filled with music and dancing. These small, private visions carried individuals forward, providing motivation where ideology faltered. Hope might take the form of saving money for a new piece of furniture, planning a holiday, or writing letters to a distant relative. It was in these modest ambitions that ordinary people invested their energy, finding meaning in goals that were tangible and achievable. The workplace, too, became more than just a site of labor. It was a community, a place where friendships formed, romances blossomed, and life stories unfolded. A factory floor echoed with the clang of machinery, but also with laughter, gossip, and whispered confidences. Birthdays were celebrated with modest parties, colleagues pooled money for gifts, and milestones were marked with toasts of vodka poured discreetly from hidden bottles. The line between work and social life blurred, creating bonds that endured long after shifts ended. In offices, life unfolded in slower rhythms. Paperwork piled high, bureaucrats navigated endless forms, and typewriters clattered as secretaries produced documents for approval. Yet even here, creativity seeped through. Workers decorated desks with photographs, flowers, or small trinkets, tiny islands of personality in seas of uniformity. Coffee breaks became opportunities for storytelling, while lunchtime walks allowed. The stolen moments of freedom. For many, the workplace was not merely a site of obligation, but a stage upon which the drama of everyday life played out. As years turned into decades, people looked back at their lives with a mixture of pride, weariness, and quiet acceptance. They measured time not in political speeches, but in personal milestones. The year they married, the birth of a child, the purchase of a new refrigerator, the holiday spent by the Black Sea. These markers told the true story of ordinary Soviet life, one far removed from the slogans etched into posters or broadcast on radios. It was a story of survival, yes, but also of laughter, creativity, and love. And so, the Soviet Union endured not just through ideology or force, but through the countless ordinary choices made by its citizens each day. Choices to share food with a neighbor, to sew a child's dress from leftover fabric, to tell a joke that lightened the heaviness of the world. In these choices, ordinary life revealed itself not as dull repetition, but as a quiet assertion of humanity. The state could regulate work, housing, and speech, but it could not erase the spark that made life worth living. By the 1970s and 1980s, the rhythms of Soviet life had settled into a strange combination of predictability and uncertainty. On the surface, everything seemed stable. The same leaders' portraits hung in offices, the same slogans echoed across streets and newspapers, and people carried on with their daily routines of work, school, and leisure. Yet underneath this veneer of constancy, cracks were quietly spreading. The shortages grew more severe, the bureaucracy more cumbersome, and whispers of discontent more audible. For the ordinary person, life moved forward in its familiar ways. But there was a growing sense that the promises of socialism had not quite delivered the paradise they had been told to expect. In cities like Moscow, Leningrad, and Kiev, daily life meant navigating an increasingly strained economy. Grocery stores often looked full on the outside, with bright banners declaring the availability of goods, but inside the shelves told a different story. It was common to enter a store and find only one or two items available, perhaps endless. Jars of pickled cabbage or stacks of bread, but no meat, no butter, no coffee. The word spread quickly when rumors of a delivery began. Housewives, pensioners, and students dropped everything to stand in line, sometimes for hours, in the hope of getting a kilogram of sausage or a bag of sugar. These queues became social spaces of their own. People talked, exchanged jokes, complained about the system, and formed friendships while waiting for the chance to buy basic necessities. Children, growing up in this world, learned patience early. They stood with their parents in long lines, holding bags or watching silently as adults whispered complaints they dared not say too loudly. Yet childhood also had its joys. Playgrounds were filled with laughter. Children sledged down snowy hills in winter. And in summer, they ran through courtyards chasing one another while mothers called them in for dinner. Many families lived in Khrushchevkas, the small prefabricated apartment blocks that spread across the Soviet Union during the post-war decades. These buildings, though cramped and often poorly constructed, gave millions of families private apartments for the first time. A one-room flat might house parents, children, and sometimes grandparents, all sharing space, privacy thin as the walls between them. But within those walls, families built lives, celebrated birthdays, and gathered around the television in the evenings. Television had by then become one of the defining features of Soviet leisure. Programs ranged from state-approved news and political speeches to children's cartoons, variety shows, and Soviet films. Every broadcast carried a layer of ideology, but people also found genuine entertainment in these shared cultural experiences. Families huddled together to watch comedies, laughing at slapstick humor, or tuned in to concerts featuring popular singers whose songs carried hints of longing or quiet rebellion hidden beneath official approval. For many, the television was not just a box of images, but a window into a larger world, even if that window was carefully controlled. The Soviet sense of culture was always intertwined with politics, but art and literature often carried undercurrents that spoke to deeper truths. Writers who pushed boundaries sometimes faced censorship, but their works traveled secretly in typewritten copies passed from hand to hand, a system known as samizdat. To read such a book was both an act of personal enrichment and a subtle form of resistance. In cramped apartments, friends would gather late at night to read aloud, whispering verses of poetry that spoke more honestly about life than the slogans on the walls. Music, too, carried these currents. Rock bands, though often frowned upon by authorities, gained underground popularity. Their tapes copied endlessly and played at gatherings where young people found freedom in rhythm and sound. In rural areas, life followed different patterns, shaped by the land itself. Collective farms struggled with outdated machinery, poor infrastructure, and inconsistent planning from distant bureaucrats. Yet village life had its own richness. Neighbors helped one another harvest, children ran barefoot through fields, and traditional customs persisted in weddings, funerals, and local celebrations. Private plots once again played a crucial role, feeding families and supplementing meager rations. Villagers traded produce, eggs, or milk in informal networks that helped soften the shortages of official supply chains. For many, survival depended less on what the state provided and more on what they could grow, barter, or borrow. The Soviet workplace, by this stage, had become both a burden and a community. Factories were noisy, outdated, and inefficient, yet workers often felt loyalty to their colleagues and to the rhythms of their shared labor. The monotony of repetitive tasks was broken by conversation, small celebrations, and sometimes subtle defiance. Workers knew how to navigate the system, how to slow production when quotas were unreasonable, how to use scraps of material for personal projects, how to stretch official hours to include moments of rest. Offices were much the same, filled with paper mountains and endless stamps of approval, but also with jokes, camaraderie, and the quiet resilience of people who had learned to adapt. Healthcare and education continued to be points of pride in official discourse. Schools educated generations with a mixture of strict discipline and genuine emphasis on science, literature, and mathematics. Children memorized poems, solved equations, and learned of the great achievements of Soviet history. Teachers often worked tirelessly despite limited resources, instilling both knowledge and discipline in their students. Hospitals still struggled with shortages, yet doctors provided care as best they could. A new mother might give birth in a crowded maternity ward, surrounded by other women and attended by exhausted but dedicated nurses. A patient might wait weeks for treatment, but when it came, it was given with professionalism born from both necessity and commitment. Perhaps the most striking element of ordinary Soviet life in these late decades was the way people carved out private worlds within the restrictions of the public sphere. The kitchen became the heart of this private life. In small apartments, families gathered around kitchen tables, drinking tea from chipped glasses, sharing meals of potatoes, bread, and preserved vegetables. But the kitchen was more than a place for food. It was where the most honest conversations happened. Here, behind closed doors, people spoke freely about their frustrations, their hopes, their fears. The kitchen table became the stage for whispered, political discussions, for storytelling, for laughter that carried the weight of truth. In many ways, it was in kitchens, not parliaments, that the true voice of the Soviet people lived. Leisure time carried its own rituals. Summer holidays, when they could be afforded, often meant journeys to dochas, small country cottages where families tended gardens, rested, and escaped the city. Life at the docha was simpler, closer to nature, and deeply cherished. Children chased butterflies in meadows, adults worked the soil, and evenings ended with the smell of grilled food and the sound of songs sung under the stars. Even if a family owned little, the dacha offered a sense of abundance, fresh air, vegetables from the garden, and moments of freedom that city life could not provide. Festivals and celebrations punctuated the year, binding society together through ritual and shared experience. Official holidays like May Day brought parades of workers carrying banners, marching bands, and speeches that filled public squares with orchestrated enthusiasm. But personal celebrations were just as important. Weddings were joyous affairs, filled with dancing, toasts of vodka, and long feasts that stretched into the night. Birthdays brought together friends and family, tables overflowing with whatever. Food could be gathered, from homemade pickles to carefully saved sweets. These gatherings revealed the resilience of joy, the human ability to create abundance even when official supplies fell short. Beneath these ordinary rhythms, however, the sense of strain was undeniable. People began to notice that promises of abundance remained unfulfilled, that shelves grew emptier, that repairs took longer, that hope seemed increasingly distant. The official speeches continued, declaring victory and progress, but many no longer believed them. Cynicism grew quietly, spreading from person to person like a hidden current. Yet even in this atmosphere, people continued to endure, to laugh, to dream. Life had to be lived, after all, and so it was, in all its contradictions, harsh and tender, restricted and resilient, ordinary and extraordinary all at once. As the 1980s progressed, the Soviet Union moved deeper into what people later called the era of stagnation. This was not a sudden collapse, but rather a slow and quiet suffocation. For ordinary people, the difference was not always easy to name. The daily routines remained the same. Children went to school, adults to work, families to dochas in summer, and parades still marched across Red Square. But there was a weariness beneath it all, a sense that life was stuck in place. What once had felt like sacrifice for a bright future, now felt like sacrifice for nothing at all in Moscow. A young worker might rise early to catch a crowded bus to his factory. The same faces boarded every morning, pressed shoulder to shoulder, the air heavy with the smell of damp coats in winter. Conversations were muted. People discussed the weather, the latest hockey results, or the rumor that coffee might finally be delivered to a certain store across town. Few dared to speak openly about politics, but in lowered voices and cautious glances, there was often an acknowledgement that something was wrong, that the country had lost its energy. Still, the bus moved forward, the factory whistle blew, and the machines clattered into motion, filling another day with labor. For women, life remained a constant balancing act. Most were employed full-time, working in offices, schools, or hospitals, and then returned home to another full shift of housework. A woman might spend her morning teaching children, her afternoon waiting in line at a shop for whatever food she could find, and her evening preparing meals, helping her own children with homework, and washing laundry in a tiny bathroom. Appliances were limited, often unreliable, and everything required more effort. Yet these women carried households on their backs with remarkable resilience. They managed to celebrate birthdays with tables full of dishes, even if it meant weeks of planning, trading, and saving. They made clothes last through patching and mending, turning scarcity into resourcefulness. In small apartments, privacy was rare. Families learned to share space in creative ways. A teenager might study at the kitchen table while his grandmother knitted beside him. Parents might whisper to each other in the hallway late at night so as not to wake the children. Walls were thin, and neighbors could often hear one another through the plaster. Arguments, laughter, lullabies, all of it carried from apartment to apartment. Yet this closeness also created bonds. Neighbors borrowed sugar, watched each other's children, and gathered together for tea. In buildings where elevators broke down for weeks, residents formed little communities, supporting one another through the irritations of daily life. The shortages grew steadily worse. Meat, butter, and cheese were increasingly rare. Even basic staples like flour or oil sometimes disappeared. In many households, meals became repetitive: potatoes, cabbage, bread, tea. Families were inventive with recipes, stretching ingredients, and learning to substitute. A special treat, like a slice of cake or a piece of fruit, felt all the more precious because of its rarity. When bananas or oranges appeared, queues stretched for hours, and people spoke of them as if they were treasures from another world. Children remembered the taste of a single chocolate bar for weeks afterward. Despite these difficulties, the Soviet sense of community and ritual persisted. New Year's Eve was still celebrated with decorated trees, sparkling lights, and the figure of Dead Moros, the Soviet equivalent of Father Frost, who brought gifts to children. Families tuned in to hear the president's midnight speech, raising glasses of champagne as fireworks lit up the sky. In moments like these, life seemed festive and bright, even if the rest of the year felt grey. Weddings, too, brought joy, with couples posing for photographs in city squares, laying flowers at war memorials, and then celebrating in banquet halls with laughter and dancing. At the same time, whispers of change were spreading. Radio waves from the West carried news, music, and stories that painted a different picture of the world. Young people listened secretly, tuning into stations like Voice of America or the BBC, careful to keep the volume low. Western jeans, sneakers, and music became coveted items, symbols of freedom and individuality. To wear denim or listen to rock was not just a fashion choice. It was a quiet act of rebellion. Parents often disapproved, worried about the risks, but they also recognized that their children longed for something beyond the walls of the Soviet Union. Education remained a central part of life, and Soviet schools maintained their emphasis on discipline and achievement. Children recited poetry, studied mathematics, and learned the stories of revolutionary heroes. But in classrooms, there was also restlessness. Students doodled guitars in notebooks, whispered about films from abroad, or dreamed of traveling beyond their country's borders. For many young people, the gap between what they were taught and what they felt in their daily lives was growing. The textbooks spoke of progress, but their parents came home from empty shops. The lessons praised abundance, but their own kitchens held little beyond potatoes and pickles. The Soviet military presence was always visible, a reminder of the state's priorities. Soldiers marched in parades, their boots striking the pavement in unison, and conscription meant that nearly every family had a son who served. For those young men, military life was often harsh. They endured poor conditions, strict discipline, and sometimes brutal hazing. Yet it was also a shared experience that bound generations together. One more thread in the fabric of ordinary life. Meanwhile, healthcare remained both a source of pride and frustration. Clinics were free, doctors were dedicated, but supplies were limited. A patient might wait months for surgery, only to find the hospital lacked necessary equipment. Medicines were sometimes unavailable, leading families to rely on herbal remedies, folk traditions, or the black market. Yet doctors and nurses carried on, improvising, finding ways to treat with what they had. For patients, there was comfort in the kindness of these professionals, even when the system itself was strained. In villages, the pace of life was slower, but the struggles were similar. Collective farms suffered from inefficiency, machinery broke down frequently, and plans from Moscow often failed to match the realities of the land. Still, rural families found ways to survive. They grew potatoes, raised chickens, and bartered with neighbors. Children helped with chores, carrying water, tending animals, or gathering firewood. Winters were long and harsh, but evenings by the stove brought warmth, with stories, songs, and the crackle of burning wood. Life in the countryside was difficult, but it was also rooted in traditions that gave it meaning. By the mid-1980s, the sense of stagnation had become heavy. People were weary of shortages, weary of bureaucracy, weary of promises that never materialized. Yet even in this atmosphere, there was resilience. Families laughed together, friends gathered for music, and children played in courtyards. The human spirit persisted, finding joy in small things. A loaf of fresh bread, a holiday at a dacha, a joke shared in line at a shop. These were the moments that carried people forward. Then came the early signs of change. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became General Secretary, and words like pure and glasnost entered everyday conversations. At first, people were cautious. They had heard promises before. But soon, there were visible shifts. Newspapers began publishing stories that had once been unthinkably about corruption, about inefficiency, even about past mistakes of the state. Television, once so carefully controlled, began broadcasting debates and discussions that felt startlingly open. Ordinary citizens, sitting in their kitchens, heard voices on their screens saying things they had whispered for years. For many, this was both exhilarating and frightening. It was strange to hear officials admit to failures, strange to see discussions of topics that had long been forbidden. Some felt hope stirring, a belief that change might finally come. Others felt unease, fearing instability or retribution. But everyone knew that something was shifting, that life in the Soviet Union was no longer as predictable as it had been on the streets. This change was visible in small ways. Demonstrations began to appear, cautious at first, then more confident. People carried banners, demanded reforms, and called for greater freedoms. In homes, conversations grew louder, less guarded. Families debated politics at dinner tables, friends argued in kitchens, and young people dreamed of futures that had once seemed impossible. And yet, even as history accelerated, ordinary life continued. Workers still reported to factories, students still studied, mothers still waited in lines for bread. Weddings were celebrated, children were born, birthdays were toasted with vodka. The great shifts of politics moved above, but on the ground, people carried on with the rhythms they had always known. This duality of extraordinary change and ordinary continuity defined the final years of the Soviet Union. For those living through it, the experience was bewildering. One day felt like any other, with buses, shops, and work. The next, a headline might announce a reform that seemed to rewrite the rules of life. People adjusted, as they always had, finding ways to live within whatever system they were given. The Soviet Union, so vast and powerful, was beginning to tremble. But inside apartments, in kitchens, on factory floors, life was still measured. In tea glasses, in laughter, in the daily determination to endure. By the late 1980s, the ground beneath ordinary Soviet life had begun to shift in ways people could not ignore. What had once been a slow, steady stagnation now felt like turbulence. Every day, there seemed to be another shortage, another change. In policy, another rumor that rippled through the population. Families who had long learned to live with little now found themselves living with even less. The queues, which had always been part of life, became longer, stretching around corners and down entire blocks. People stood for hours in the biting cold of winter or the sticky heat of summer, hoping to purchase even the simplest items: bread, soap, sugar. For many, these lines became part of the rhythm of life. A grandmother might wake before dawn, pulling on her thick coat and scarf, to secure a place in a queue that had already begun forming in front of a shop. She would bring a small stool to sit on, or perhaps a thermos of tea, and there she would wait. Conversations formed among strangers commiserating about shortages, trading rumors of what goods might arrive, sometimes even forging friendships out of shared hardship. People marked their places with bags or scraps of paper, ducking away briefly, knowing that everyone understood the unspoken rules of the queue. When the shop doors finally opened, the atmosphere grew tense. Shelves inside were often half empty, stocked with random assortments of good pickled cabbage, tinned fish, perhaps a few loaves of bread. People hurried forward, voices rose, and clerks struggled to keep order. If word spread that meat or butter had arrived, the line surged with restless energy. More often than not, the goods ran out before everyone was served, leaving those at the end to shuffle home empty-handed. Yet, even in disappointment, people carried on. Tomorrow, they knew there would be another line, another chance, another hope inside apartments. Families grew increasingly inventive with meals. Potatoes became the backbone of nearly every dish: boiled, fried, mashed, baked. Cabbage stretched across countless recipes, from soups to stews to pickled jars lined up on shelves. Families bartered with neighbors sugar for eggs, soap for tea, flour for butter. A bag of oranges brought from abroad became a precious gift, sometimes shared among many relatives so that everyone could taste a single slice. The black market, long existing in shadows, grew bolder, filling the gaps left by failing stores. on street corners or whispered in markets. Connections were made. Cigarettes, imported jeans, chocolate. Even medicines could be obtained if one knew whom to ask. Children, meanwhile, adapted as children always do. They continued to play in courtyards, kicking balls across cracked pavement, jumping rope, or improvising games with whatever scraps they could find. Television offered both distraction and confusion. Programs once carefully controlled now featured debates and discussions that seemed astonishing to older generations. For the first time, ordinary citizens saw officials criticized openly, scandals revealed, and histories re-examined. Young viewers listened wide-eyed as voices spoke of freedoms, corruption, and futures that felt both exciting and frightening. In schools, teachers struggled to adjust to this changing landscape. Lessons, once rigid and unquestioned, were now met with skepticism. History books, which had long presented the past as a single, unchanging truth, were suddenly contradicted by newspapers and television. Students asked questions that teachers could not always answer. What had really happened during the purges? Why had certain leaders, once praised, now been condemned? How could a system that promised abundance be delivering such scarcity? For some educators, this was liberating. For others, it was deeply unsettling. At home, the conversations grew louder. Kitchens, once places of hushed whispers, became spaces of open debate. Families argued over politics late into the night, the smell of tea and bread lingering in the air as voices rose and fell. Some believed reforms would save the Soviet Union, finally opening doors to prosperity. Others were certain that the entire system was unraveling, that no amount of change could mend what was broken. For young people especially, the possibilities seemed boundless. They dreamed of travel, of studying abroad, of listening to music and reading books that had long been forbidden. But not everyone welcomed these changes. Many older citizens who had lived through war, through rebuilding, through decades of sacrifice, felt uneasy. They had built their lives within the framework of the Soviet Union, endured hardships with the belief that stability was worth the price. Now, that stability was slipping away. The rituals of life, the May Day parades, the certainty of employment, the sense of belonging to a vast and powerful state were being eroded. For these people, the reforms felt less like freedom and more like chaos. Meanwhile, nationalism stirred in the republics. In places far from Moscow, local identities and grievances re-emerged. Demonstrations filled streets. Flags appeared that had not been seen for decades, and voices called for independence. For ordinary people, this meant both pride and fear. A teacher in Lithuania, a farmer in Georgia, a factory worker in Ukraine all began to wonder what the future held. Would their republics break free? Would there be conflict? Would life improve? Or would it grow even harder? As 1990 arrived, the cracks were impossible to ignore. The economy was faltering, shops were bare, and inflation was beginning to take hold. Wages no longer stretched as far, and even those with money found little to buy. Ordinary citizens carried rubles in their wallets that seemed to shrink in value by the week. Barter grew common, with people trading goods and services rather than relying on unreliable currency. In rural villages, this felt familiar, but in cities, it was a shock. Professionals, engineers, teachers, doctors found themselves trading skills for food. Despite the hardships, life's milestones continued. Couples still married, though receptions were often simpler, with tables less full than in past years. Children were still born, swaddled in cloth, rocked to sleep with lullabies passed down for generations. Funerals were still held, with neighbors gathering to pay respects, to share in mourning. In every corner of the Soviet Union, life persisted, even as the state around it faltered. The year 1991 brought both climax and collapse. In August, tanks rolled through Moscow as hardliners attempted to seize control in a coup. Ordinary citizens watched in disbelief as images filled their television soldiers on the streets. Barricades, crowds gathering in defiance. For a few tense days, it seemed as though the country might descend into violence. Yet when the coup failed, the momentum toward change accelerated beyond return. Flags of new nations rose where once only the red banner had flown. The Soviet Union, that vast and mighty state, fractured before the eyes of its people. For the ordinary Soviet citizen, the end was surreal. 1 month, they were Soviet. The next, they were Russian, Ukrainian, Estonian, Kazakh. Borders shifted on maps, anthems changed, currencies transformed. In some places, independence was celebrated with joy, with parades and songs. In others, it was met with uncertainty, with fear of the unknown. For many, it was both at once a mixture of hope and loss. Daily life adjusted yet again. Shops began to fill with goods, but prices soared, and many could not afford what they had long desired. Western brands appeared: Pepsi, Marlboro, Levi's, of a new world entering everyday existence. Yet at the same time, unemployment, once unthinkable, emerged. Factories closed, wages went unpaid, and the security that had defined Soviet life was gone. For older generations, it felt as though the ground had vanished beneath their feet. For younger ones, it felt like possibility, though possibility mixed with struggle in apartments. The conversations shifted. Families now discussed how to navigate a world without guarantees. Would pensions be enough? Could wages keep up with inflation? Should young people study abroad, seek opportunities elsewhere? The kitchen tables that had once hosted debates about reform now hosted debates about survival. In a market economy, yet alongside the worry, there was also laughter, hope, and resilience. People celebrated weddings, marked birthdays, raised toasts, and carried forward for the millions who had lived their entire lives under the Soviet Union. Its collapse was not just a political event. It was the reshaping of daily existence, the end of one world and the uncertain birth of another. Ordinary life filled with queues, shared apartments, factory shifts, and communal celebrations had been lived within the framework of the Soviet state. With that state gone, people carried their memories forward into a future that was at once freer and more uncertain than anything they had known. In the quiet moments, as winter nights settled over Moscow, Kiev, Tbilisi, or Riga, people sat by their windows, looking out at streets that seemed both familiar and changed. The sound of footsteps in stairwells, the scent of cabbage from kitchens, the murmur of voices from neighbors' apartments all remained the same. And yet everything had shifted. The Soviet Union, as a state, ended in December of 1991. But for the people who had lived their entire lives inside it, the end was not clean, nor simple, nor easily understood. Ordinary life, the texture of days, the rhythm of routines, not vanish with the stroke of a pen or the lowering of a flag. Instead, it lingers, carried within memory, within habits, within the objects that fill a home for many. The 1990s were not a sudden leap into freedom and abundance, but rather a difficult continuation of hardship in a new form. The lines that had defined Soviet shopping disappeared as markets filled with goods. At last, shelves brimmed with fruit, vegetables, chocolates, meats, bright packaging from abroad. But the joy of choice came at a steep cost. Prices rose rapidly, far beyond the wages of many workers. Inflation devoured savings. A family who had once proudly counted rubles now found themselves spending entire monthly salaries on basic necessities. This paradox abundance without accessibility was bewildering. In Soviet times, there had been little to buy, but money meant something. Now there was much to buy, but money slipped like sand through the fingers. Grandmothers shook their heads, muttering that at least in the old days, bread was cheap and guaranteed. Young people, however, marveled at the sight of bananas and chewing gum piled high in stores. For them, the world had suddenly grown wider, even if it was out of reach. The black market, which had thrived in secrecy, moved into the open. Street kiosks sprang up on every corner, selling everything from imported cigarettes to pirated cassette tapes of Western music. Small businesses flourished as men and women took risks, opening stalls, trading goods, seeking opportunities. For many, this was exhilarating, an explosion of possibility after decades of state control. For others, it was frightening, a world without the safety nets they had relied upon. And yet, through all this, the habits of Soviet life persisted. In apartments, furniture still bore the stamp of state factories, heavy and sturdy, designed to last decades. Shelves sagged under the weight of books published by Soviet presses. Their spines faded, their content shaped by the ideology of the past. Kitchens still smelled of cabbage soup and fried potatoes, meals that stretched budgets and comforted stomachs. Radios still hummed with the voices of familiar announcers, though the tone was different now. Conversations remained a vital thread in this fabric of daily existence. Just as, in the years of shortages and censorship, people still gathered in kitchens late into the night, mugs of tea or glasses of vodka in hand, discussing the changes around them. Some reminisced about the certainty of Soviet life, its routines, and its predictability. Others celebrated the freedom to speak openly, to criticize leaders without fear, to travel, to dream. Memory became a point of division. For those who had come of age in the decades after the Second World War, the Soviet Union represented resilience and unity. They remembered rebuilding cities from rubble, sending children to free schools, receiving healthcare without charge, celebrating holidays that brought entire communities together. For younger generations, however, the memories were mixed with frustration, the endless queues, the lack of choice, the feeling of being cut off from the rest of the world. This divide often showed itself in small, intimate ways. A grandfather might tell his grandchildren that in his youth, everyone had work, everyone felt part of something larger. The grandchildren might roll their eyes, pointing to the jeans they now wore, the pop music they listened to, the bright packaging of snacks bought from a kiosk. Both were right, and both were wrong. Memory is selective, shaped as much by feeling as by fact. Even today, in the years long after the Soviet Union's fall, echoes of ordinary Soviet life remain. Walk into an apartment block in Moscow, Kiev, Minsk, or Tbilisi, and you will find the same stairwells with peeling paint, the same smell of boiled cabbage drifting from behind doors, the same voices echoing off concrete walls. In kitchens, teapots whistle on gas stoves, and jars of pickled vegetables line shelves, just as they did decades before. Old photo albums preserve images of parades, weddings, school children in uniforms, factory workers posing beside machinery. There is a nostalgia that clings to these memories, even among those who once grumbled at shortages and censorship. Nostalgia is not always about truth, but about comfort, the comfort of remembering childhood summers at pioneer camps, of marching in parades, of singing songs in unison, of knowing that tomorrow would look very much like today. The uncertainties of the post-Soviet years, with their sharp inequalities and rapid changes, made the predictability of the Soviet past seem, in retrospect, like a kind of security dot, of course. Not everyone shares this nostalgia. Many remember the repressions, the fear of speaking too openly, the heavy hand of the state in every corner of life. For them, the collapse was liberation, the chance to breathe freely, to discover truths long hidden, to connect with a wider world. Ordinary life under the Soviet Union, they insist, was not a golden age, but a daily endurance test, where creativity and resilience were born of necessity, not abundance. And yet, whether one looks back with longing or with relief, the fact remains. The Soviet Union shaped the lives of hundreds of millions, and the imprint of that experience cannot be erased. The shared routines of lining up for bread, of watching state television, of working in factories or collective farms, of celebrating May Day under banners of red all, of these created a common memory, a bond that lingers even after the state itself has vanished. When people today sit down to tell stories of their youth, they often do not speak of politics, or of leaders, or of great historical events. Instead, they speak of the texture of life, of the smell of fresh black bread bought from a bakery, of the sound of a neighbor's radio playing in the courtyard, of the taste of homemade jams spread on thick slices of bread, of the long summer evenings when children played until dark. It is in these details that the true portrait of ordinary Soviet life is preserved. Perhaps the most enduring legacy is the resilience of the people who lived it. Through shortages, through changes, through uncertainty, they carried on. They found joy in small things, pride in survival, humor in hardship. They learned to make do, to improvise, to share. These qualities, forged in the crucible of ordinary Soviet life, continue to echo in the generations that followed. As the decades pass, the Soviet Union becomes history, studied in books, debated in classrooms, remembered in documentaries. But for those who lived it, it is not simply history, it is memory woven into the fabric of who they are. The state may be gone, the flag lowered, the anthem silent, but the lives lived beneath that system remain vivid, real, and deeply human. And so, when we ask, what was ordinary life like in the Soviet Union? The answer is not found in statistics or policies, but in the quiet moments. In a grandmother standing in line before dawn for bread, in children playing in a courtyard between grey apartment blocks, in families gathered around a kitchen table, laughing, arguing, sharing. Ordinary life was, above all, human life, resilient, complex, and enduring. It is in those memories, carried forward, that the Soviet Union still lives not as a government, not as an ideology, but as the lived experience of millions of ordinary people